Chapter 47:10. For a moment, the third palace master was very jealous of the murderer Yi Jingfeng. That thought popped up in his mind again. How great would it be if he could take these three female god emperor under the command of the Taiyu Shrine? At the very least he, the first palace master and the second palace master would not be alone. They would not even have a suitable partner and they would not be able to reproduce. That was indeed the case. The more powerful a god was, the more difficult it was for them to reproduce. The God Emperor realm was the best in the universe and no one could match it. Only when two God Emperor realms combined would they have a chance to reproduce. If a God King or a God Emperor realm was married, it would be impossible for them to reproduce even if they could be husband and wife. Just as these messy thoughts flashed through the third palace master's mind, the three female God Emperor realms suddenly unleashed their god power, turned around and fled into the distance. The third palace master was stunned. When the three female God Emperor realms gathered together, they were aggressive and full of fighting spirit. He thought that they would bravely launch an attack. He did not expect that they would decisively turn around and flee while he was distracted. The third palace master dispelled these messy thoughts and hurriedly used teleportation. He flickered in the night sky and chased after the three female God Emperor realms. Qianzhan hesitated for a moment. He could only endure his injuries and chase after them reluctantly. If possible, he hoped that the third palace master could fight the three female God Emperor realms alone. Only then would he have time to rest and suppress his injuries. However, the third hall master had gone to hunt down the three female divine emperors. If he stayed where he was, he would definitely be punished by the deity hall and be convicted of desertion. Yunyao, Jiku and Panri God Emperor realms unleashed their strongest powers and sped through the night sky like shooting stars cutting through the night sky. Under normal circumstances, Panri God Emperor realms would definitely be faster than Yunyao and Jiku. However, she did not run away by herself. Instead, she maintained the same speed as Yunyao and Jiku while paying attention to the third palace master's position. She knew very well that if she ran away with all her might, it was very likely that she would be able to escape the third palace master's pursuit. However, Yunyao and Jiku were too slow. They would definitely be caught by the third palace master and might even lose their lives. She had to follow Yunyao and Jiku so that she could take care of them. Just as she had expected, the third palace master had caught up to them after the three of them had only escaped 30,000 miles away. The third palace master's target was very clear. He brandished a pair of curved blades and used his ultimate skill to attack Yunyao and Jiku. The two of them were the weakest, and the third palace master was confident that he could kill them both within 3 moves. Whoosh! Swish! The sharp blades of divine light that filled the sky carried terrifying divine power and the power of Taoist rhymes. They locked onto Yunyao and Jiku and instantly appeared in front of them. The two of them had their auras locked onto and could not escape at all. They could only use all their strength to form a shield to block the third palace master's fatal attack. However, the result was predictable. The two of them could not block the third palace master's attack. Even if they did not die, they would be severely injured. At this critical moment, the Pan-God Emperor, who had been waiting for a long time, brandished his divine sword and charged over to block the third palace master's attack. Sword of Firmament. The Pan-God Emperor roared angrily. He held the divine sword with both hands and slashed out a giant sword that was 10,000 feet long and as dazzling as the sun. Kaboom! Amidst the deafening loud noise, the giant sword that was 10,000 feet long struck the sharp blades of divine light that filled the sky. Billions of fragments of divine light exploded and illuminated the night sky for tens of thousands of miles. The Pan-God Emperor's sword of firmament was shattered by the sharp blades of divine light that filled the sky and collapsed on the spot. She was also pushed back by the extremely powerful force. She vomited blood and flew dozens of miles away. However, 70% of the power of the third palace master's divine art attack had been neutralized by her. The remaining sharp blades of divine light also dimmed a lot. When they hit Yunyao and Jiku again, they were no longer fatal. Bang bang bang. Yunyao and Jiku released sword auras, divine fire and spear shadows that filled the sky and clashed with hundreds of sharp blades of divine light. There were dull and loud noises that echoed in the sky. The divine arts that they had cast were defeated and the power of the sharp blades of divine light was weakened again. Even if they hit them and broke their protective divine light, they only suffered some minor injuries. Swish! Swish! The powerful impact also sent Yun Yao and Jiku flying. They rolled 100 miles away. While they were still in midair, their clothes were already stained with blood. Their faces were pale and their breaths were unstable. The third palace master only used one move to injure Pan Ruo, Yun Yao and Jiku at the same time. It was enough to show how powerful he was. "Ha! You lowly servants can't be used by my divine hall. Then all of you can die." Looking at the three injured female god emperor, the third palace master laughed contemptuously. He waved his two sharp blades again and pounced forward with a murderous aura. His target was still Yun Yao and Jiku. He waved his pair of sharp blades and slashed out sharp blades of divine light that filled the sky. He locked onto Yun Yao and Jiku. Pan Ruo God Emperor was already injured and had been pushed hundreds of miles away. It was too late for her to help Yun Yao and Jiku. At this critical moment, a furious roar came from the night sky not far away. "Thief, how dare you!" Hearing that familiar voice, Pan Ruo, Yun Yao and Jiku's eyes lit up. They were excited. They knew very well that it was Ji Tianxing's voice. In the night sky not far away, the figure rushing over was Ji Tianxing. Ji Tianxing had returned, which meant that he had already dealt with Dao Xingyun. Tonight's mission had been completed. Since the mission was completed, there was no need to tangle with the third palace master anymore. He just needed to think of a way to retreat. Swoosh. Before Ji Tianxing arrived, a dark golden sword light that was tens of thousands of feet long had already slashed toward the third palace master. It was the sword of destruction that he used. Not only did it contain a terrifying sword intent, but it also contained more than 1,000 types of laws and divine powers. It also contained an extremely powerful Taoist rhyme. This sword attack was fierce and powerful. It was not meant to kill the third palace master, but to dissolve his attack and save Yun Yao and Jiku. Ji Tianxing was 2 levels lower than the third palace master, and he had 2 fewer Taoist rhymes than the third palace master. However, he had absorbed the power of the world and used all his strength to slash out this sword light. His power was shocking. Boom. Crack. In the deafening sound, the giant golden sword that was tens of thousands of feet long shattered the sharp blades of divine light that the third palace master had released. Hundreds of millions of divine light fragments exploded and sputtered in all directions, affecting a radius of 30,000 miles. Although the sword of destruction had collapsed, the sharp blades of divine light that the third palace master had released were all shattered. The pressure on Yun Yao and Jiku was greatly reduced. They used their divine powers, secret techniques, and the sword light and flaming spear light that filled the sky hit the third palace master. Unfortunately, the third palace master's body was protected by divine light and his defensive power was too strong. Yun Yao and Jiku's attacks did not cause any harm to him. However, this was not a big deal. While the third palace master dissolved Yun Yao and Jiku's attacks, the two of them quickly turned around and ran toward Ji Tianxing with Pan Ruo. Swoosh. Swoosh. In the blink of an eye, the three of them crossed thousands of miles and arrived in front of Ji Tianxing. Ji Tianxing had already taken out the Jiutian 10 Absolutes Pagoda and put them into the distorted spacetime. Then he put away the Jiutian 10 Absolutes Pagoda and ran away without looking back. Chapter 47:11. Swish. In order to get rid of the third palace master, Ji Tianxing used his ultimate skill, so close yet so far. His figure flashed in the night sky, and in the next moment he traversed the night sky and appeared 100,000 miles away. After the third palace master dispelled the sword radiances and spear shadows, he went to search for Ji Tianxing again. He found that Ji Tianxing was already 100,000 miles away. He couldn't help but be stunned. This bastard is so powerful? Even the third palace master didn't have such a divine power, let alone the god emperor who had condensed 4 Taoist rhymes. The first hallmaster and second hallmaster were probably the only ones in the entire Taiyu Sacred Hall who could use such a shocking divine power. The planet of origin was the highest level plane in the world. The space there was too strong. Those who weren't god emperor couldn't even teleport. They could only fly. Even the mid-level god emperor could only teleport 20 to 30,000 miles at a time. That was the limit. Although the third palace master was shocked, he didn't plan to let Ji Tianxing go. This damned bastard caused such a big mess. He even killed the 7th palace master, Dao Xingyun. I'm here. If I don't capture or kill him, I'll be blamed by the first palace master. The third palace master didn't have a personal feud with Yi Jingfeng. If he could, he wouldn't bother to kill him. It would be fine if he could kill Yi Jingfeng successfully. If he couldn't and fell into Yi Jingfeng's trap, it wouldn't be worth it whether he was killed or severely injured. However, there was no reason for the third hallmaster not to go after Yi Jingfeng after what happened tonight as the person in charge. After all, Dao Xingyun was the seventh palace master of the Taiyu Shrine. If Yi Jingfeng killed him, he would be going against the Taiyu Shrine. Whether it was to avenge Dao Xingyun or to protect the dignity of the Taiyu Shrine, he had to kill him. Just like that, the third palace master ran desperately in the night sky and chased after Ji Tianxing without caring about anything else. The effect was also very obvious. In just a few minutes, the distance between the two of them was shortened by tens of thousands of miles. However, 15 minutes later, when the distance between the third hall master and Yi Jingfeng had shrunk to 30,000 miles, something happened that left him flabbergasted. Swish! Yi Jingfeng flashed with white light again and disappeared from the night sky. In the next instant, the other party traversed the night sky and appeared 100,000 miles away. How can he use such a powerful divine power continuously in such a short time? What kind of freak is he? Isn't he afraid of being devoured by divine power? The third palace master's divine sense had locked onto Yi Jingfeng, who was 130,000 miles away. According to common sense, the ability to teleport 100,000 miles was definitely a trump card that could save one's life. Under normal circumstances, such a divine power could not be easily to use. Once he used it, it would be impossible for him to recover his vitality in a short period of time. He might even suffer a severe backlash. But Yi Jingfeng had not only used it twice in a quarter of an hour, but he was also safe and sound. This was simply unscientific. But it had already happened. No matter how shocked the third palace master was, it was useless. He could only bury his head and continue to chase. 80,000 miles away from him. In the night sky, Qianzhan was running at full speed, trying to catch up with the third palace master. He thought that as long as the third palace master could catch up with Yi Jingfeng and fight with him, he could delay him for a while. At that time he could take the opportunity to catch up and help the third palace master. If the third palace master killed Yi Jingfeng, then as the third palace master's helper he would also make a great contribution. To be honest, he was not sad or angry that the seventh palace master was killed by Yi Jingfeng. Instead, he was a little happy. Dao Xingyun was dead, and the position of the seventh palace master was empty again. If he made a great contribution tonight, he would have a great chance to ascend to the throne of the seventh palace master. It was because he thought of this that he was so brave and active. However, Yi Jingfeng had already disappeared. The third palace master was also running at full speed and quickly pulled away from him. No matter how hard he tried, he could not catch up with the third palace master. He could not even close the distance. Since he could not catch up with him, he could only find something else to do. At least he could make some contributions. Therefore, he quickly thought of an idea and quickly took out a few communication jade slips. Palace Master, the murderer has already sneaked into the Battle Dragon Divine Palace. He attacked the seventh palace master while the third palace master and the seventh palace master were setting up the divine formation. Tonight we found out that the murderer did not act alone. He took over the body of my aide Yi Jingfeng. He even had the help of 3 female god emperor. Qianzhan slowed down and hurriedly sent the message into the communication jade slips. After a while, he roughly explained the ins and outs of the matter and sent it to the 4th, 5th and 6th palace masters, as well as the second palace master who was overseeing the great universe mystery realm. After doing this, his heart calmed down a lot. He thought to himself, although I can't help the third palace master and can't capture or kill the culprit, I can report to the palace masters in a timely manner about what happened tonight. After all, I should have made a contribution, right? Qianzhan silently comforted himself and calmed down a lot. Then he slowed down his flying speed and slowly flew forward. He took out a divine elixir and silently circulated his energy to suppress his injuries. The third palace master was unusually persistent. In order to catch up with Ji Tianxing, he almost used all his trump cards. He did not hesitate to consume a huge amount of divine power and desperately chased after him. His speed did not decrease at all. 1 million miles, 3 million miles, 10 million miles. He chased after Ji Tianxing for an entire day and night, flying nearly 200 million miles, but he did not give up. During this period, he constantly shortened the distance between him and Ji Tianxing. The distance between the two of them continued to shrink from hundreds of thousands of miles. However, every time he was only 30 to 40,000 miles away from Ji Tianxing would use the ultimate skill, so close, yet so far, and instantly teleport 100,000 miles away to increase the distance between them again. After a few times, the third palace master understood that his opponent would not suffer any backlash or injuries from using such a shocking ultimate skill. After that, Ji Tianxing would use it every 15 minutes, 30 minutes and 45 minutes to increase the distance between them. After he repeatedly used so close, yet so far more than 30 times, the third palace master was so shocked that he became numb. He knew very well that if there were no accidents, it would be very difficult to catch up with his opponent. And his only chance was when his opponent's divine power was exhausted and his speed decreased so that he could no longer use so close, yet so far. Only then would he be able to catch up with his opponent. But what happened next made him completely disheartened and he lost all hope. After flying continuously for a day and a night, Ji Tianxing still did not slow down, and could still use the unique skill of close yet worlds apart. Furthermore, the distance between the two of them had increased to over 300,000 miles. No matter how powerful the third palace master was, his divine consciousness could only cover a radius of 300,000 miles. His divine sense was unable to lock onto the other party, and it was even harder for him to determine the direction the other party was heading in. Helplessly, he could only give up the chase. Chapter 47:12. Huff, huff. Under the pitch-black night sky, the third palace master stood high up in the sky. Cold winds were blowing beside him and clouds were flying past. He was panting violently, his chest rising and falling. His face was as cold as ice. Staring at the vast sea of clouds in front of him, he clenched his fists and growled, "Damn bastard! How can he be so good at running away when he has only condensed 4 Taoist rhymes? Despicable fellow, did he use all his cultivation talent and effort on running away?" If the other party dared to stop and fight, the third palace master was confident that he could defeat and capture the other party. However, the other party had made up his mind to run away and did not show any signs of stopping to fight. This left the third palace master at his wits' end. Now that he had lost track of the other party, everything came to an end. The dust had settled. Even if the other party was still within the Taiyu Shrine's sphere of influence, it would be like looking for a needle in a haystack to find the other party. At this moment, the third palace master was not thinking about how to catch the culprit again, but how to deal with the first palace master's anger. He could already imagine the first palace master's expression and reaction when he found out that the culprit had escaped. "Sigh, it's not that I didn't try my best, but the culprit is too cunning." The third palace master sighed helplessly and turned around to fly back. He flew for an entire day before he met Qianzhan, who had arrived late. Seeing Qianzhan, the third palace master's emotions and expression were as complicated as his expression. He wanted to get angry and reprimand Qianzhan. This fellow's attitude was passive and he was traveling at a leisurely pace. However, the third palace master changed his mind. Qianzhan was not strong to begin with and he was heavily injured. It was understandable that he was traveling at a slow speed. Most importantly, this fellow did not give up and insisted on following, which comforted the third palace master. Moreover, the seventh palace master Dao Xingyun had been killed. The position of palace master was vacant, and this fellow was the designated seventh palace master. They would all be palace masters in the future and they would work together. There was no need for the third palace master to form a grudge with him now. Therefore, the third palace master suppressed the anger in his heart and stopped in front of Qianzhan. Qianzhan hurriedly bowed and apologized. This subordinate came late and was unable to help the third palace master. "Please forgive me, palace master." The third palace master looked at his fearful expression and did not say anything. He only sighed and patted his shoulder. After that, the third palace master led Qianzhan back to the original location of the divine battle dragon palace to deal with the aftermath. Qianzhan originally wanted to ask about the results of the battle. Did they catch the culprit and kill him? However, when he saw the third palace master's face and expression, he could guess the result. He swallowed the words that he was about to blurt out. After another 18 hours, the third hall master and Qianzhan returned to the original location of the battle dragon divine palace. Originally, there were towering mountains and splendid palaces here, but now they were all in ruins. There were many broken fences and broken walls in the ruins. The ground was covered with bricks and rubble. It was a complete mess. The surviving 20,000 guards had already returned to the ruins. Under the command of many generals, they were working together to clean up the ruins and treat the wounded. Seeing the well-trained soldiers cleaning up the battlefield in an orderly manner, the third palace master showed a look of approval. Qianzhan also felt proud. These guards were the elites under his command. They did not embarrass him at the crucial moment. Unfortunately, the previous battle between the God Emperor experts had destroyed the Divine Battle Dragon Palace and killed more than 10,000 guards. If he wanted to gather over 10,000 elite God Kings and nurture them into loyal elites, it would probably take another few centuries. Next, Qianzhan personally directed the surviving guards to clean up the ruins and rebuild the Divine Battle Dragon Palace. The third palace master waited there and helped Qianzhan restore the surrounding mountains and set up the grand formation of the palace. The next day, the third palace master received a message from the second palace master and the first palace master, asking him about the results. The third palace master did not hide anything. He told the two palace masters about the process and the result. The second palace master was very disappointed after receiving the news. The first palace master was furious. He felt sorry for the death of the seventh palace master, Zhou Xian. He was also furious that the third palace master could not catch the culprit. Without a doubt, the first palace master severely reprimanded the third palace master and Qianzhan in the message Jade Slip. The third palace master could not refute and could only accept his punishment. That night, the fourth, fifth, and sixth palace masters rushed back to the Divine Battle Dragon Palace. They already knew the result on their way back. Now that they saw the Divine Battle Dragon Palace in ruins, they could imagine how tragic the battle was. The four palace masters gathered together and did not blame each other. They all helped Qianzhan to rebuild the Divine Battle Dragon Palace. However, the few palace masters were still suppressing the anger in their hearts. They were very unreconciled. At the same time, the first palace master, who was far away in the Taiyu secret realm, gradually calmed down and gathered the second palace master to discuss the next plan. Just as the palace masters expected, the Taiyu shrine suffered a great loss. Not only were more than 800,000 people kidnapped, but the seventh palace master Zhou Xian was also killed. The first palace master would not let this go. Even if the culprit had escaped, the first palace master would mobilize the power of the shrine to capture the culprit again and kill him. This was not only to save the Taiyu shrine's face, but also to save more than 800,000 people. More importantly, it was for the peace of the shrine in the future. They must eliminate the culprit. In the depths of the Taiyu shrine, in the first palace master's private room. He was still sitting at the top of the altar while the second palace master stood below the altar. The two of them had a serious conversation. At this moment, the second palace master said, "First palace master, according to the third palace master's report, the culprit is a total of 4 god emperors. 3 of them are female god emperors. 2 of them are at the initial level of God Emperor, and 1 is at the middle level of God Emperor. The mastermind should be a man of a different race. He possessed the body of advisor Yi Jingfeng under Hidden Warfare's command. That's why he was able to sneak attack Zhou Xian and kill Zhou Xian." The first palace master frowned and analyzed. Since the culprit is 4 god emperors, 2 of them are at the middle level of God Emperor, and 2 are at the initial level of God Emperor, then it makes sense. According to this emperor's deduction, a few months ago, the woman at the middle level of God Emperor abducted our people and created chaos everywhere. Then, the man at the middle level of God Emperor possessed the body of Yi Jingfeng under Hidden Warfare. Yi Jingfeng's performance was outstanding, so Hidden Warfare made an exception and promoted him to advisor. From then on, Yi Jingfeng lurked around Hidden Warfare and knew the movements of the other palace masters as well as our plans. Therefore, the palace masters ran around outside for a few months but were unable to catch the culprit. When the third palace master brought Zhou Xian to the south, Yi Jingfeng received the news and sent a message to the female god emperor, ordering her to return to the Divine War Dragon Palace. With Yi Jingfeng's help, the female god emperor easily entered the Divine War Dragon Palace. Then Yi Jingfeng sneak attacked Zhou Xian in the middle of the night. Chapter 47:13. Hearing the first palace master's analysis, the second palace master nodded in agreement. That's right, First Palace Master's analysis is right. This should be the truth. From the beginning their goal was Zhou Xian. They abducted people, created chaos, and left Zhou Xian's emblem behind to force Zhou Xian to show himself. The second palace master nodded slightly and continued with a serious expression. If Zhou Xian had stayed in the Taiyu secret realm, they would not have dared to assassinate him. Only when Zhou Xian left the secret realm and went to the south would they have a chance to kill him. Before Zhou Xian was sent to the south, he suggested a way for us to release fake news that he had gone to the south to lure the murderers out. But we rejected that method. Now that I think about it, Zhou Xian's method is indeed not feasible. After all, Yi Jingfeng was hiding beside the hidden warrior, so he would definitely know the truth. The first palace master nodded and agreed with his analysis. He continued, from the beginning they were in the dark while we were out in the open, so we were in a passive situation. So far there were no problems with the plans and actions we had taken. The only problem was that they took advantage of the time difference and took action before the 4th, 5th and 6th palace masters arrived at the War Dragon Divine Palace. Yes, what a pity. The second palace master sighed. If we were 2 days later when the 3 palace masters arrived, none of the 4 murderers would be able to escape. They would all die. The first palace master narrowed his eyes and exuded a cold and murderous aura. He said in a low voice, even now it's not too late. Yi Jingfeng shook off the third palace master and thought he could escape unscathed. Humph. Since the establishment of the first palace master, I have never suffered such humiliation and grievance. This time not only will the other palace masters take action, but you will also follow me to catch the murderers personally. In order to catch the murderers, take revenge and wash away the humiliation, the first palace master was going all out. When the second palace master heard this, he immediately revealed a shocked expression. He asked in disbelief, First palace master, you have not personally taken action for tens of thousands of years. Are you really going to personally take action this time? Of course. The first palace master's tone was firm and resolute. The second palace master furrowed his brows and asked, however, my territory is far too large. We've already lost track of the murderer. Where are we going to find him? He has the strength of a god emperor. Even if he's hiding in our territory, finding him is like finding a needle in a haystack. The grand palace master shook his head and said, Zhou Xian told me that there were 5 god emperors who came to Planet of Origin with him. As far as he knew, there was a god emperor of a foreign race in the territory of every temple. There was also a god emperor of another race who had occupied an unknown land and was quietly developing his power. The alien god emperor who came into contact with the Kongming temple had his plans foiled before he was promoted to the position of temple master. After that, his whereabouts were unknown. The Shura god emperor who came into contact with the Shangqing temple was tragically killed in the Sea of Chaos. Now Zhou Xian, who came into contact with me, was also killed by the murderous series of conspiracies. What does this mean? The second palace master understood immediately and was suddenly enlightened. This means that the murderer who took over Yi Jingfeng's body has a grudge with those alien god emperors. He will search the territories of the 4 great temples and find those alien god emperors one by one to take revenge. Therefore, after he killed Zhou Xian, he will not stay in my territory. According to the previous practice, he will leave our territory and rush to the next temple, the Pantheon of Immortality. The first palace master nodded in agreement and continued to analyze. According to the murderer's previous movements, he came from the west and went to the east. Therefore, his next target is most likely the alien god emperor of the Pantheon of Immortality. From the War Dragon Divine Palace to the Pantheon of Immortality in the east, find the straight path, and we can deduce the murderer's approximate location. The second palace master's eyes lit up and he was excited. He said, that's right. Find the route on the map, and according to the murderer's speed, we can deduce his approximate location. In addition, before the murderer leaves my territory, he will have to pass through a few places. We can use the teleportation formation of each hall to rush to the border area in advance and set up an ambush there. The first palace master showed a gratified expression and nodded. That's right, this is exactly what I was thinking. Next we will follow this plan. Good. The second palace master agreed readily and took the initiative to deploy the plan. First palace master, I will take out the map immediately and mark the murderer's route. Then I will inform the other 4 palace masters and let them rush to the predetermined location first and set up an ambush. The first palace master nodded slightly and left these matters to the second palace master. Pausing for a moment, the corners of his mouth curled into a playful smile, and he continued to ask, "Do you know, other than avenging the 7th hallmaster and saving more than 800,000 people, what other reason is there for me to be so persistent in capturing the murderer?" The second palace master was stunned. He had not thought about this question carefully before and did not delve into it. However, since the first palace master asked, it meant that there was more to it. He could only frown and ponder. As the founder of the Divine Palace, the first palace master was certainly wise and resourceful. However, the second palace master, who had been in power for tens of thousands of years, was experienced and not mediocre. He quickly analyzed a secret from all the information and his eyes lit up. "I understand now. The murderer and the 5 alien god emperors who came to the Star of Origin all came from your hometown, the realm of gods. However, the murderer dared to use all kinds of schemes to kill the 5 alien god emperors. This means that his strength, schemes, talents, and methods are far superior to the 5 alien god emperors. The alien god emperors that the 4 great temples came into contact with are actually not the chosen ones at all. It is impossible for them to ignite the eternal fire and open the gate of heaven. If there is really a chosen one in the world, the murderer is the most likely candidate. First palace master, am I right?" After listening to the second palace master's analysis, the first palace master smiled with relief. He stroked his white beard and nodded in agreement. "That's right. Your analysis is very accurate. It is not in vain that I have handed the Divine Palace over to you for so many years. Since ancient times, only the ancestor back then has become the only immortal. For nearly 30,000 years, the 4 great temples have entered the Chaos Sea many times to explore the mystery of the Gate of Heaven. During this period there were all kinds of dangers and heavy casualties, but we have never succeeded. The eternal fire on the Gate of Heaven is often extinguished and occasionally reignited. It is definitely foreshadowing something. It is because of this that I brought up the concept of the Chosen One, and made the other 3 great temples believe in it." Chapter 47:14. The second palace master quietly listened to the first palace master's analysis and statement. Although he looked calm on the surface, his heart was already boiling with excitement and anticipation. He continued the first palace master's words and continued, "Over the past 30,000 years, we have screened almost all the people in the territory, but the results were very weak. Only 2 god emperor experts were cultivated. One was the 6th palace master and the other was a hidden warrior. But neither of them were the chosen one. Therefore the chosen one might not be a member of the desolate race. It is very likely that he is an ascended god emperor of a foreign race. All the things that happened before can prove that the murderer is very likely the target we are looking for." The first palace master stroked his beard and said, "It's good that you can understand this reason. Also, you have to tell this reason to the other 4 palace masters. Only in this way will they not have any doubts and will not be passive and negligent. You have to let them understand that this time the Taiyu Shrine will come out in full force. We are absolutely determined to win." "Yes, master." The second palace master bowed and hurriedly took out a communication jade slip. He said, "I will now send a message to the 4 palace masters. I will explain the reason to them and emphasize the importance of this mission. I will also tell them our action plan." The first palace master nodded and did not speak. He closed his eyes and began to rest. The second palace master took out 4 communication jade slips on the spot and sent messages to the 4 palace masters one after another. After doing this, he thought of another thing and asked tentatively, "First palace master, the murderer will leave our territory as soon as possible and rush to the Pantheon of Immortality. I mean, if we can't catch him at the border and he escapes into the Pantheon of Immortality's territory, what should we do? Should we inform the Pantheon of Immortality and ask them to send a few palace masters to lead elite troops to set up an ambush at the border?" The first palace master glanced at him and shook his head gently. He said, "Jun Bummy is not an easy person to deal with. Once he knows that we have come out in full force just to catch an alien god emperor, he will be very suspicious. With his wisdom, he will immediately infer that the alien god emperor is likely to be the chosen one. At that time, no matter how much you explain and evade, you will not be able to hide the truth. Do you want the Pantheon of Immortality to compete with us? The second palace master hurriedly replied, I understand. We have to keep the matter of the murderer a secret. We can't let Jun Bummy know about it. Especially the spies and informants that he planted in our palace. We must get rid of them as soon as possible. The first palace master waved his hand again and said, It's too late to eliminate those spies now. The Pantheon of Immortality probably knew about what had happened before. Hundreds of thousands of people had gone missing and the south was in chaos. At this time, if you go to clean up the spies of the Pantheon of Immortality, won't you be making things worse by trying to cover it up? Jun Bummy will definitely realize the seriousness of the matter and pay more attention to it. The second palace master finally understood what the great palace master meant. He nodded and said, All right, I understand. We can't eliminate the spies of the Pantheon of Immortality, and we can't let them get the information either. Furthermore, the 6 of us hall masters have turned out in full force to capture the culprit. This must be kept a secret and must not be leaked. That's right. The great palace master finally nodded and waved his hand to signal the second palace master to leave and make preparations for the next operation. The second palace master bowed and left the secret room in a hurry to make preparations. At the original location of the divine palace of war dragons. Regardless of whether it was day or night, the 18,000 guards under the command of the many generals worked tirelessly to rebuild the divine palace. After 2 days and 2 nights of hard work, the ruins of the divine palace had been cleaned up, the mountain peak had been repaired and the foundation was ready. Then the palaces and mansions were growing at a speed visible to the naked eye. At this speed, the palaces and mansions would be restored in 2 days at most. However, the many defensive formations of the divine palace would take 10 days to half a month to be gradually completed. In addition, the destroyed mountains and peaks within 100,000 miles of the divine palace were restored to their original state one by the hall masters. Hidden warfare was extremely busy every day. The hall masters, on the other hand, were much more relaxed. They only needed to give orders and occasionally use magic. At this time, the 4 hall masters received a message from afar almost at the same time. After opening the message jade slip and reading the contents of the second palace master's message, the 4 hall masters were stunned. They did not expect the great palace master to be so persistent. He would not let the murderer go and would personally hunt and capture him. Originally, the hall masters thought that this was making a mountain out of a molehill. The great palace master had not taken action for tens of thousands of years. In order to avenge the 7th palace master and save more than 800,000 people, he did not hesitate to participate in the operation himself. However, after reading the second palace master's explanation, they realized that the murderer's identity was not simple. It was very likely that he was the one chosen by heaven. Since that was the case, what else was there to say? It was reasonable for the great palace master and the second palace master to participate in the operation personally. The 4 hall masters did not resist the great palace master's order at all. Instead, they were excited and their blood was boiling. They gathered together and discussed this matter in private. All of them looked as if they had suddenly realized something. No wonder the murderer's strength and cultivation are not high, but his methods are superb. The murderer wants to travel through the 4 great palaces to find the 5 god emperors of the alien tribes and kill them all. What kind of deep hatred is this? Comparing the two, it is indeed convincing. The few god emperors of the alien tribes, including Dao Xingyun, are not the one chosen by heaven we are looking for. Only the murderer might be. In the past 30,000 years, we have put in so much effort to explore the Chaos Sea several times. We have sacrificed countless people, but we have never found anything. If we finally find a target that seems to be the one chosen by heaven, of course we have to do our best. We can't let it go. The second palace master has given us the murderer's target and the route map to the east. Let's not waste any more time. Use the teleportation formation as soon as possible and rush to the eastern border to set up an ambush. There is no need to be so anxious. We can use the teleportation formation of the various halls and reach the eastern border in 2 days at most. No matter how powerful the murderer is, it will take at least 4 to 5 months to arrive. That is what you say, but we still have to act as soon as possible so that we can set up an ambush earlier. Right, the second palace master has specially instructed us to keep it a secret and not leak the news. Yes, it is necessary to keep it a secret. If the news leaks out and the people of the Pantheon of Immortality know, it will be dangerous. This operation, including the news of the Great Palace Master personally taking action, is only known to the 6 of us Hall Masters. Even the hidden battle is not allowed to know. Humph. If he had not been careless and been possessed by the murderer, Yi Jingfeng would not have found out. How could things have developed to this point? Logically speaking, in such a situation the hidden battle should be punished. Chapter 47:15. The 4 Hall Masters discussed in private for 4 hours. They confirmed their destination according to the murderer's escape route, provided by the 2nd Hall Master, and formulated their next plan. Then they started their operation without telling Qianzhan. The first step was to leave the War Dragon Divine Palace. They couldn't disappear suddenly, as that would arouse Qianzhan's suspicion. The 4 Hall Masters used the excuse that the war was over and the reconstruction of the War Dragon Divine Palace was mostly completed. The rest could be left to Qianzhan. They had to return to the secret realm to report to the 1st Hall Master. This excuse was very reasonable. Qianzhan didn't think much of it. Thus, the 4 Hall Masters left the War Dragon Divine Palace and pretended to fly north. But after flying for hundreds of thousands of miles, they entered stealth mode and quietly flew east. 10 hours later, the 4 Hall Masters quietly arrived at the headquarters of the Heaven Dipper Hall. They secretly found the Hall Master and ordered him to activate the teleportation array. The Hall Master was shocked. He found it hard to believe and was also very puzzled. What had happened? The teleportation array was the biggest secret and trump card of the Heaven Dipper Hall. Not only did it consume a terrifying amount of resources to build, but it also consumed an astronomical amount of resources every time it was activated. For tens of thousands of years, the teleportation array of the Heaven Dipper Hall had only been activated a few times. But the Hall Master's doubts were not answered. The 4 Hall Masters' actions were very secretive. Only the Hall Master knew that they had come, but he didn't know where they were going or what they were going to do. In addition, the 4 Hall Masters also gave the Hall Master a gag order to not reveal their whereabouts. As the teleportation array was activated, the 4 Hall Masters stepped into it and were quickly swallowed by the blazing white light. In the blink of an eye, they crossed billions of miles and left the Heaven Dipper Hall. They appeared in a branch next door. After entering the branch hall, they appeared in a vast mountain range. About 1,000,000 miles away from the mountain range was the main city of the branch. Like before, the 4 Hall Masters moved stealthily and secretly entered the main city of the branch to find the Hall Master. This was the first time the Hall Master saw the 4 Hall Masters at the same time. He was shocked and in disbelief. What happened next was basically the same as before. The Hall Master was full of doubts. He carefully asked the 4 Hall Masters why they had secretly visited and what orders they had for him. The 4 Hall Masters ordered him to keep it a secret and activate the teleportation array. As for their intentions and whereabouts, he absolutely could not inquire about them, much less leak any information about them. Just like this, 4 hours later, the 4 Hall Masters stepped into the teleportation grand formation and left the branch to head to the next branch. In the following 2 days the same thing happened again and again. The 4 Hall Masters moved forward in secret. They quickly rushed to the easternmost territory through the teleportation formations of the various halls. During this process the news was completely kept secret. Other than the Hall Masters of each hall, no one knew that the 4 Hall Masters had come. 2 days later, in the middle of the night, the 4 Hall Masters arrived at the last stop, the Dongchen Hall. This was a territory directly east of the Taiyu Shrine. It was also a place one had to pass to reach the Pantheon of Immortality. To the east of the Dongchen branch was an endless stretch of primitive forests and mountains. This was an unknown land that the Taiyu Shrine had yet to conquer. After crossing the vast unknown land, they would reach the territory of the Pantheon of Immortality. After the 4 Hall Masters arrived at the Dongchen branch, they secretly found the Hall Master and conversed with him in a secret room. Although it was called a conversation, it was actually the Hall Masters giving orders. The Dongchen Hall Master only needed to listen and carry out the orders. Under the command of the Hall Masters, the Dongchen Hall Master gathered all the elite godly kings under his command. There were about 8,000 of them. These elite godly kings were to be divided into dozens of small teams and form a north-south defensive network in the territory of the Dongchen branch. They had 3 months to prepare. They could set up large formations in the areas they were responsible for to monitor and intercept. After 3 months they would patrol day and night. With the help of various large formations, they would monitor all abnormal situations. The Dongqin Hall Master could not rest. Not only did he have to be responsible for dispatching these elite godly kings, he also had to carry out missions personally. Even the 4 Hall Masters would not be idle. They would also set up many large formations in the territory of the Dongqin branch. As long as it was an area that was on the escape route of the murderer, they would set up a divine formation every 10 million miles. They did not hope that these divine formations would be able to ambush the murderer Yi Jingfeng. They only hoped that they would be able to find traces of the murderer. The Dongqin Hall Master was not stupid. After hearing the orders of the 4 Hall Masters, he guessed that the 4 Hall Masters had come here to intercept a certain expert. A person that was worth the 4 Hall Masters intercepting at the same time was definitely not a godly king. It had to be a god emperor expert. After analyzing this point, the Dongqin Hall Master was very nervous. He was excited but also worried and anxious. The 4 Hall Masters had secretly come here and ordered him to carry out a mission. This meant that something big had happened. The deity hall placed great importance on this matter. If he followed the orders and cooperated with the 4 Hall Masters, he would be able to complete the mission. It would be a great merit. His meteoric rise would be just around the corner. However, the target that the deity hall wanted to capture was a god emperor expert. In the process of carrying out the mission, once he came into contact with or fought with the enemy, he would definitely die. Therefore, to him, this mission was both an opportunity and a risk. However, the arrow had already been knocked and had to be released. The 4 Hall Masters had come and treated the Dongqin branch as a battlefield. He had to follow their orders. A few days later, the orders given by the 4 Hall Masters in the Dongqin branch gradually began to be carried out. At this time, the 4 Hall Masters sent a message to report the situation to the 1st Hall Master and 2nd Hall Master. The 2 Hall Masters also quietly left the Grand Universe Mystic Realm. They would also secretly rush to the Dongqin branch through the teleportation arrays of the various branches. At that time, the 6 Hall Masters would gather here and work together to set up an inescapable trap, waiting for the murderer to appear. It had been 5 days since Ji Tianxing escaped from the 3rd Hall Master's pursuit. Not long after he escaped from the 3rd Hall Master, he took out the deity-slaying battleship and let Bai Long drive the battleship toward the east. In order to conceal his whereabouts and not be discovered by the people of the Taiyu Shrine, the deity-slaying battleship also activated the array. Not only did it become invisible, but it also blocked all auras. Now, the deity-slaying battleship had already left the Big Dipper Hall and was about to cross one branch after another to rush to the last deity hall. Just as the 1st Hall Master had analyzed, Ji Tianxing came to the Taiyu Shrine this time only to seek revenge on Dao Xingyun. After killing Dao Xingyun, there was no need for him to stay in the Taiyu Shrine. Of course, he had to rush to the Pantheon of Immortality as soon as possible to find the god of the underworld and Lu Zhiyang. He clearly remembered that before Dao Xingyun died, he chose to give up resisting. Dao Xingyun would rather be killed than send out that communication jade slip. It was not hard to imagine that he must have notified the god of the underworld and Lu Zhiyang to remind them that Kenshin was coming for revenge. Therefore, Ji Tianxing had to rush to the Pantheon of Immortality as soon as possible to prevent the god of the underworld and Lu Zhiyang from escaping in advance. Chapter 47:16. Previously, Ji Tianxing had killed Dao Xingyun. Later on, he was chased by the 3rd Palace Master. Even though he was only slightly injured, it was not a big deal. However, during the day and night that he was chased, he had used the ultimate skill, so close, yet so far, dozens of times. Although using this ultimate skill would not backfire, there were no serious repercussions. However, every time he used it, he would use up a huge amount of god power. His mind would also be severely damaged. After using it dozens of times, no matter how vast Ji Tianxing's god power was or how strong his mind was, he could not hold on any longer. He was very weak. It could be said that his vital energy was greatly damaged. His mind was also very weak. He let the White Dragon drive the battleship while he returned to the distorted space-time of the Jiutian 10 Absolutes Tower to recuperate. Yun Yao, Ji Ku and God Emperor Pan Ruo were also heavily injured. After entering the Jiutian 10 Absolutes Tower, they had been recuperating under the Bloody Flame Sacred Tree. Now they had used up a huge amount of elixirs and cultivation resources. Their injuries were also stable. Ji Tianxing had also used up a huge amount of cultivation resources to recover his strength and condition as soon as possible. Unknowingly, 2 months had passed in the outside world. The god-slaying battleship had crossed the 9 halls and was only halfway through the journey. It was estimated that they would have to continue traveling for another 2 months before they could leave the Taiyu Shrine's territory. At this time, Ji Tianxing, Yunyao, Jiku, and the others had been recuperating in the distorted spacetime for more than 10 years. Ji Tianxing's strength had completely recovered. He was also back to his peak condition. However, Yunyao, Jiku and Pan Ruo's injuries were still quite serious. A mere 10 years of recuperation was far from enough. They would probably have to go into seclusion for another 10 years to recover. After Ji Tianxing ended his seclusion, he walked around the bloody flame sacred tree to check on everyone's cultivation situation. Now that he had the help of the 3 female god-emperor goddesses, his revenge plan could be carried out more smoothly. His own power had also increased by a lot. However, he knew very well that facing the god of the underworld and Lu Juyong would be much more difficult if they were prepared in advance. If there were a few more god-emperor powerhouses among his friends and family, that would be even better. Not only would he succeed in his revenge in the future, but he would also have the opportunity to stand on the same level as the 4 great temples after his revenge. He wouldn't have to be afraid of being suppressed or besieged. However, after looking around, he was somewhat disappointed. Presently, the friends and relatives by his side had basically all reached middle-level Divine King strength. Among them, Bai Feng's strength was the strongest. She had long been a peak Divine King, yet she was still unable to break through to the God-Emperor realm. Those who were slightly weaker than Bai Feng were Ji Wuhan, Ji Wushuang, Yang Chao Qingyu, Bai Long, Hei Long and Qianyu. They were all high-level Divine Kings. As well as Ji Tianxing's followers Zhan Wudi, Nangong Nihuang, Lon Kai and Yu Pa. The stronger ones were at the 9th level of the Divine King realm, while the weaker ones were at the 8th level of the Divine King realm. In Ji Tianxing's eyes, these people's talents were top-notch, and they had sufficient cultivation resources to support them. However, they still lacked some time and foundation to reach the peak of the Divine King realm. As for breaking through to the God-Emperor realm, perhaps only Bai Feng, Wuhan, Wushuang, Hei Long and Qianyu had a chance. Those who were slightly weaker were Lin Shui or Zhen Hong, Divine King Blood Fantasy, Left Emissary Jean, Blood Dragon Right Emissary, and more than 20 followers of Ji Tianxing. They were all middle-level Divine Kings. These people had been cultivating in seclusion in the distorted spacetime for many years. They didn't lack cultivation resources, nor did they lack the guidance of powerhouses. However, they were limited by their own talents and qualifications. They were destined to never break through to the God-Emperor realm. The highest they could achieve was peak Divine King realm. In addition, among the many cultivators under the Blood Flame Sacred Tree, there was one who was more special. That was the last disciple of the Pan-Ri God Emperor, Divine King Xianxia. She had been a peak Divine King for a long time. Her talents and qualifications were top-notch, and she had a certain chance of breaking through to the God Emperor realm. However, she only obeyed the orders of the Pan-Ri God Emperor. She couldn't be considered as Ji Tianxing's subordinate. At least for now, she still held a grudge against Ji Tianxing. She couldn't be used by Ji Tianxing. After the inspection, Ji Tianxing sighed silently. He couldn't help but think of his friends who were still in the Dragon Realm and the Divine World. Back then, I was in a hurry to find the Star of Origin. I happened to meet the 5 God Emperor Realm experts who broke through the fog of chaos. If only I was more prepared and brought the Red Dragon Emperor, Black Dragon Emperor, Sacred Dragon Emperor and Ophiuchus over. How good would that be? Given their peak Divine King strength after many years of cultivation on the Star of Origin, and with my help, half of them should be able to break through to the God Emperor realm? At this thought, Ji Tianxing felt that it was a pity. He silently thought that if it was possible in the future, he should think of ways to get in touch with his old friends. Besides the cultivation problems of his friends and family, Ji Tianxing also checked the remaining cultivation resources. Back when he was in the Divine World, roaming the void and traversing the 9 galaxies, he had plundered an endless amount of cultivation resources. He had thought that those cultivation resources would be enough for him and his friends and family to cultivate in seclusion for tens of thousands of years. However, later on when he left the Divine World, he brought along a group of followers and 50,000 elite soldiers. Supporting his friends and family as well as those 50,000 soldiers consumed too many cultivation resources. It had only been 20 years since he left the divine world, but nearly half of the cultivation resources that he had accumulated had been used up. Among the ordinary cultivation resources, there weren't many high-level and top-notch elixirs, divine stones and so on left. Ji Tianxing couldn't help but feel worried. He had to make plans for the future. Later on, I'll refine Dao Xingyun's godhead, take his wealth and recruit his soldiers. Hopefully, I'll be able to obtain a large amount of cultivation resources that can last for a few years. However, after I kill the god of the underworld and Lu Zhiyang, I'll still have to go to the Chaos Sea and plunder more cultivation resources. As for the future development plan, he had a rough idea in his mind. Although the land was vast and had many cultivation resources, it still couldn't be compared to the Chaos Sea. If he wanted to plunder a large amount of cultivation resources quickly, he had to go to the Chaos Sea. After making up his mind, Ji Tianxing took out Dao Xingyun's godhead fragment and started to refine it. Dao Xingyun was a mid-level god emperor who had condensed 4 Taoist rhymes and was once an overlord. Although his Taoist rhymes had collapsed and dissipated after his death, the godhead fragment left behind memories, many laws and divine patterns as well as a large amount of divine power. Ji Tianxing refined the godhead fragment because he wanted to absorb more divine power and obtain more divine Dao laws so that he could gather the 3,000 great Daos as soon as possible. All these years, as he became stronger and stronger, his connection with the heavenly Dao deepened. He was also looking forward to what would happen when he cultivated the 3,000 great Daos in the future. Since ancient times, no one had heard of anyone who could gather the 3,000 great Daos. Perhaps that was the end of the divine Dao. Who knew? Chapter 47:17. Time passed quietly. Ji Tianxing used a total of 3 months to refine Dao Xingyun's godhead fragment. As he expected, Dao Xingyun was also a god emperor that could not be underestimated. He actually condensed more than 1,800 law runes. Most of the divine Dao laws were repetitive and useless to Ji Tianxing. In the end, he only took away 200 types of divine Dao laws and refined them for his own use. Thus, the number of divine Dao laws he'd grasped had arrived at a shocking 2,700. Although he dared not say that such a terrifying number was unprecedented, it was definitely one of the top existences in the world. The only thing that interested him was whether the mysterious ancestor who obtained eternal life on the planet of origin had mastered so many divine Dao laws. In addition to the divine Dao laws, Ji Tianxing also absorbed a portion of Dao Xingyun's divine power and heavenly Dao comprehension. This allowed his strength to increase a little, and his divine Dao foundation was more stable. His strength was more abundant. Although his realm did not increase, he was still in the middle stage of the God Emperor and had condensed 4 Taoist rhymes. However, his realm had been stable for a long time, and his 5th Taoist rhyme had a fledgling form. He would have a chance to condense the 5th Taoist rhyme after cultivating for a few more decades or 100 years. The key was that Ji Tianxing had refined a portion of Dao Xingyun's divine soul memories. In the past, he had refined the Azura God Emperor's memories. Now that he had obtained Dao Xingyun's memories, he had a deeper understanding of Yu Ming and Lu Zhiyang's situation. One thing he could confirm was that the 2 communication jade slips that Dao Xingyun sent out before his death were indeed sent to the god of the underworld and Lu Zhiyang. They also revealed that the Kenshin had arrived. One could imagine that the god of the underworld and Lu Zhiyang would definitely take action after receiving the message. However, Ji Tianxing originally thought that Dao Xingyun had a better relationship with the god of the underworld and would know about the recent situation of the god of the underworld. Unexpectedly, the god of the underworld had not contacted Dao Xingyun for 2 years. 2 years ago, the god of the underworld seemed to be in contact with the pantheon of immortality. Dao Xingyun didn't know how the 2 sides negotiated and whether they worked together. As for Lu Zhiyang, there were still no signs of him coming into contact with any of the temples. He was still developing his forces in the unknown lands, taking in all kinds of foreign beings and even the beast. There was also another piece of information. Among the 5 god emperors, the god of the underworld was the strongest and the one who hid the deepest. This aroused Ji Tianxing's vigilance. He could guess that it would be more troublesome to deal with the god of the underworld in the future. His experience in the 5 elements world and the god world back then proved this point. In order to search for the heaven-punishing array, The god of the underworld secretly supported the heaven-punishing race to conquer the major star regions in the lower realm and almost swept through the 3,000 worlds. From this, it could be seen that the god of the underworld was the most shrewd and the most powerful. After refining Dao Xingyun's godhead fragment, Ji Tianqing began to count his spoils of war, which were Dao Xingyun's spatial ring and divine weapon. First he obtained Dao Xingyun's natal divine weapon, an emperor-level array disc. The bronze array disc was square and usually only the size of a palm. It looked very exquisite. The four sides of the array disc were carved with exquisite patterns. Hundreds of suns, moons, and stars were engraved in the array disc, as well as many mountains and rivers. It was obviously a treasure that encompassed heaven and earth and understood the secrets of heaven. It was a pity that Dao Xingyun's natal divine weapon was an array disc, not a weapon or armor. When Ji Tianqing launched a sneak attack on him, this array disc did not play much of a role. Otherwise, Dao Xingyun would have been able to struggle at death's door for a while and would not have died so quickly. Now that Dao Xingyun had died long ago, the divine soul imprint left in the array disc had also dissipated, and it had become an ownerless item. Ji Tianqing thought for a while and decided to refine it for his own use first. When the time was right, he would give it to Yun Yao or Ji Ku so that they would have an emperor-level divine weapon to protect their lives. However, he still had to consider one thing. There was a world inside the nebula array disc. It was similar to the world inside the Sword of the Burial of Heaven and could accommodate billions of living beings. Dao Xingyun's 50,000 elite soldiers were hiding in the nebula array disc's inner world and had been recuperating. When Ji Tianqing refined the array disc, he had to think of a way to subdue those soldiers. Otherwise, he could only kill those soldiers to prevent future troubles. After putting away the nebula array disc, he began to check Dao Xingyun's spatial ring. Dao Xingyun's spatial ring was a supreme-grade king-level item. The space inside was very vast, like a small world. In the small world that shone with starlight, there were all kinds of cultivation resources piled up in different categories. There were divine stones, materials for refining pills, refining weapons, and setting up arrays. There were also all kinds of divine pills, divine weapons of various grades, and many strange and miscellaneous things. There were dozens of types of divine items and they were all piled up into mountains. However, every cultivation resource was placed neatly, and the various categories were also placed separately. It was clear at a glance. It's placed so neatly. I didn't expect Dao Xingyun to be so particular. Maybe he's passionate about arranging troops and setting up arrays, so he developed the habit of arranging things neatly? Ji Tianqing thought to himself and began to estimate the value of the many cultivation resources. Even though his eyes were like torches and his mind was like lightning, it still took him 2 days to count the many cultivation resources. After a rough estimate, Dao Xingyun's wealth was more than 400 trillion divine stones. This did not include the dozens of supreme-grade king-level divine weapons. After all, Dao Xingyun had once been an overlord. He had controlled a continent in the divine realm and a star field in the outer realm for more than 1,000 years. During those 1,000 years, he had ordered his soldiers to plunder resources day and night. Although 80% of the cultivation resources had been used to break through the chaos fog on the planet of origin. However, the cultivation resources that Dao Xingyun had intercepted far exceeded Ji Tianqing's wealth. With these resources of more than 400 trillion divine stones, Ji Tianqing could last for many years. The plan to plunder resources in the Chaos Sea could be postponed. After checking the spoils of war, Ji Tianqing took out dozens of supreme-grade king-level divine weapons and began to distribute them to his friends and family. Those supreme-grade king-level divine weapons were used as rewards by Dao Xingyun to reward the soldiers who had made great contributions. Now Ji Tianqing distributed them according to the cultivation methods of his friends and family, or their own divine power attributes, and so on. For example, Ji Wuhan and Ji Wushuang not only received supreme-grade king-level defensive divine weapons, but also received weapons suitable for them and divine weapons to assist in cultivation. Bai Feng, Bai Long, Chao Qingyu, Yang Qianyu, Black Dragon, and the others also received at least 2 supreme-grade divine weapons. As for Lin Shui, Zhen Hong and the others as well as the other followers, they also received at least 1 supreme-grade king-level divine weapon. With this batch of supreme-grade king-level divine weapons, everyone's combat strength rose to another level. After dealing with the supreme-grade king-level divine weapons, Ji Tianqing calmed down and began to refine the nebula array disc. Chapter 47:18. The 50,000 soldiers under Zhou Xian were still in the inner world of the nebula array disk. They were all conserving their energy and increasing their strength. Although the nebula array disk had become an ownerless item after Zhou Xian was killed, there was no change in the inner world. However, there was no change in the inner world of the disk array, and it was impossible for it to shake. The disappearance of Zhou Xian's soul imprint would not affect the inner world of the nebula array disk. Unless the nebula array disk collapsed or was damaged, the inner world would shake. Therefore, the 50,000 soldiers knew nothing about what was happening in the outside world. Xianxia secretly observed the reactions of the soldiers. Seeing that they were kept in the dark, he was relieved. He didn't pay any attention to the soldiers. First, he used his qi to refine the nebula disk array, completely controlling it in his hands. In just half a year, the nebula array disk had been refined by him and became his weapon. Of course, although he controlled the nebula array disk, he could only use 80% of its power. He still needed many years of nourishment and refinement before he could completely control it and turn it into his natal divine weapon. At that time, not only would he be able to fully unleash the power of the nebula array disk, but he would also be able to use it for a long time. After controlling the nebula array disk, Xianxia began to arrange the 50,000 soldiers. He did not show himself directly. He connected with the nebula array disk through his mind and looked down at the inner world. The inner world of the nebula array disk was at least a few billion miles wide. There were boundless grasslands, majestic mountain ranges, lush forests, large rivers, and all kinds of magnificent scenery. There was no sun or moon in the sky. There were only tens of thousands of stars that never changed. Those stars were real. Back in the day, Zhou Xian had captured more than 30,000 real stars in the outer space and refined them. In the end, the impurities of the stars were all removed. Only their essence was left, and they were shrunk by tens of thousands of times. Therefore, one star after another with a diameter of 10,000 miles was placed in the sky of the nebula array disk world. They were always shining with dazzling starlight. There was no day or night in the nebula array disk world. It was filled with extremely rich star power. Specks of light could be seen everywhere in the sky and on the ground. They were all condensed from the power of the stars. In some places, the power of the stars was too condensed, forming silver ribbons of light that flowed like small streams. Other than the rich power of the stars, the cultivation resources in this world were also very abundant. The more than 50,000 soldiers were recuperating here. Even if Zhou Xian did not provide them with cultivation resources, they would not lack resources. Since the formation board was named Nebula, Xianxia also named the inner world of the formation board Nebula. He looked down at the entire nebula world and instantly understood the situation of the entire world. Very quickly, he found the location of the 50,000 soldiers. Although the nebula world was vast, the soldiers were smart enough to gather at the center of the world, where the power of the stars was the densest. That was the origin of all the mountain ranges. It was a mountain range that reached tens of thousands of feet high. With this majestic mountain range as the center, tens of thousands of mountain ranges extended in all directions. They were laid out on the ground like a grid, forming the network of the nebula world. At the center, there were 9 huge peaks that reached tens of thousands of feet high. They stood tall, and under the starlight, they looked extremely sacred and majestic. More than 50,000 soldiers were spread out on the 9 giant peaks. They built many palaces and residences. They also built many herb gardens, beast gardens, and weapon refinement workshops in the surrounding valleys and mountain ranges. There were even some male and female soldiers who were Dao companions or husband and wife. They had even given birth to children. On the peaks of the various peaks, in those palaces and residences, the figures of some children could be seen. However, among the 50,000 soldiers, there were only slightly more than 1,000 women. Therefore, there were not many people who could reproduce. Currently, there were only slightly more than 30 children. Today was the same as usual. The nebula world was as calm and peaceful as ever. Most of the soldiers were still in their own residences, silently cultivating. A small number of soldiers were walking around. They were either exchanging cultivation experiences with their companions or picking herbs to feed the divine beasts. Probably everyone felt that the nebula world was controlled by Zhou Xian and was the safest place. Therefore, the palaces and residences on the 9 peaks did not have any guards, not to mention patrolling personnel. In any case, the nebula world had not encountered any danger or setbacks for so many years. However, at this moment, the unchanging starry sky suddenly underwent a drastic change. Dark clouds appeared out of nowhere and quickly covered the sky, covering the stars in the sky. The dazzling starlight was blocked by the dark clouds, and the world was quickly swallowed by darkness. On the peaks of the 9 huge peaks, hundreds of palaces and residences were all plunged into darkness. Only blurry shadows could be seen. Although the 50,000-plus soldiers were basically all Divine Lord Realm experts, as well as a portion of Divine King Realm experts. Since they were all gods, none of them feared the darkness. They had been under the starlight for many years. Suddenly being swallowed by darkness, they still felt uneasy and fearful. Many people realized that something must have gone wrong. Therefore, exclamations could be heard from the various palaces and residences. Hundreds of Divine King experts hurriedly ended their cultivation and flew into the night sky to check the situation. The 9 huge peaks were in chaos. Many palaces and residences lit up. Fortunately, other than the dark clouds covering the sky and the disappearance of the stars, there was no other disturbance. After the initial panic, the soldiers in the various palaces and residences gradually calmed down. The Divine King commanders and generals all stood up to maintain order. They asked the soldiers to stay in the palaces and not act rashly. Many of the generals gathered together and whispered to each other, asking what had happened. The 4 commanders gathered together to ask Divine King Yunque about the situation. When Dao Xingyun was not present, Divine King Yunque, as Dao Xingyun's disciple and a peak Divine King expert, was the backbone of the soldiers. However, Divine King Yunque looked around for a long time and did not find anything unusual. Faced with the questions of the 4 commanders, he was helpless. He could only send a message to Dao Xingyun. Everyone, don't be anxious. Let me ask Master first and the truth will come to light. Divine King Yunque thought to himself. Master might have encountered something or fought with someone and used the nebula disk array, resulting in such a situation. However, he did not receive a response for a long time after sending the message. Divine King Yunque was filled with anxiety. He had a bad premonition. He used all sorts of methods and even used the most urgent method to contact Master. Even if Dao Xingyun was fighting with someone, as long as he received a message, he would immediately respond. Unfortunately, all the messages Divine King Yunque sent were like stones sinking into the sea. His expression turned uglier and uglier. The anxiety in his heart gradually turned into an ominous premonition. Chapter 47:19. Divine King Yunque had been under Dao Xingyun's tutelage for many years. He understood Dao Xingyun's habits. In all these years, such a thing had never happened. His strong intuition told him that something must have happened to his master. However, he knew that the 4 commanders were watching him. More than 20 generals and 50,000 soldiers were also waiting for his news. At this moment, not only could he not panic, he had to maintain his calm and make a timely and reasonable response. Even though Divine King Yunque had already suppressed the fear and uneasiness in his heart and tried his best to appear calm, Dao Xingyun did not reply to Dao Xingyun's message. However, Dao Xingyun did not reply. This was something that the 4 great generals were watching. Even though he comforted everyone, telling them not to panic and to line up in an orderly manner so that they could await orders at any time, it had little effect. The 4 commanders passed down his orders, but the 50,000 soldiers were terrified and uneasy. They were distracted and the execution of the orders was very poor. After passing down the orders, the 4 commanders began asking what was going on. Divine King Yunque naturally could not answer. He could only change the topic with the 4 commanders. But the more he did this, the more flustered the 4 commanders became. Although Divine King Yunque had used his authority as a final disciple to chase the 4 commanders away, the moment the 4 commanders returned to their residences, they were surrounded by a group of generals. The generals were also burning with anxiety as they repeatedly asked what had happened. The 4 commanders obviously had no answer. They could only stammer and change the topic. This made things worse. The dozens of generals were unsure and made wild guesses, making the matter even more serious. When they returned to their troops and were questioned by their commanders and warriors, they had no way of explaining. Therefore, in a short hour, the 50,000 soldiers were in an uproar. There were discussions everywhere about what had happened. The officers and soldiers had different opinions. Each of their guesses was more serious than the previous one. All kinds of rumors and wild guesses popped up at the same time. Just like that, the 50,000 soldiers were in a state of panic. It was as though the sky had collapsed and the apocalypse had arrived. Divine King Yunque became even more anxious when he saw this. He called the 4 commanders over and scolded them, asking them how they had caused such a situation. The 4 commanders felt wronged as well. They could only urge God King Yunque to think of a way to ask the Nebula God Emperor what was going on. Divine King Yunque felt bitter in his heart, but he could only tell the truth. He had already tried all means to contact his master many times. However, from beginning to end he did not receive any response from his master. He could only confess to the 4 generals that something must have happened to Zhou. However, there was no need to be too worried. After all, Zhou was a god emperor and had joined the Taiyu shrine. Even if something happened, it wouldn't be serious and would pass quickly. The 4 commanders were skeptical, but they could only return to their own camps and comfort their subordinates. After a day, the 50,000 soldiers gradually calmed down from their initial panic and fear. Godly King Yunque finally heaved a sigh of relief and continued to contact Dao Xingyun. However, right at this moment the world underwent another drastic change. In the pitch-black starry sky, a huge screen of blazing white light appeared. The 9 giant peaks that had been swallowed by the darkness were illuminated by the screen of blazing white light and regained their light. The 50,000 soldiers were excited and thought that the situation had taken a turn for the better. However, when everyone looked at the screen of blazing white light in the sky, they realized that an image had appeared on the screen. The image was none other than the overlord they were loyal to, Dao Xingyun. He was fleeing pathetically in the night sky and being chased by Yi Jingfeng. When the tens of thousands of soldiers saw Dao Xingyun, they were shocked and exclaimed in disbelief. This was because Dao Xingyun looked too miserable. Not only had his head exploded, but his face was covered in blood. Even his divine body was damaged. He looked as uncoordinated as a puppet. Ordinary people wouldn't be able to see the problem, but Divine King Yunque was Dao Xingyun's disciple and a peak Divine King expert. Of course, he could see that Zhou's head had been shattered and his divine body had died when he was escaping. The reason why the godhead remained in his divine body was because he was using his divine body as a defensive tool. His heart immediately sank to the bottom and his fists unconsciously clenched. Then the 50,000 soldiers looked up at the screen of light in the sky and saw Dao Xingyun's divine body being shattered and his godhead being destroyed. In an instant, the 9 giant peaks were in dead silence. Everyone was stunned and dumbfounded. No one would have thought that the god Emperor Xingyun, whom they worshipped like a god, would be killed so easily. After a while, the blazing white light in the sky dissipated and the world returned to darkness. The 9 giant peaks were swallowed by the darkness again. However, when the 50,000 soldiers came back to their senses, they instantly erupted with earth-shattering roars, cries, and screams. The god Emperor was killed? How is this possible? I don't believe that it's true. Why? Why didn't the god Emperor choose to escape when faced with that sword? Why did he send a message? Didn't they say that the god Emperor had already cooperated with the temple? Where are the experts from the temple? Why didn't they help? The god Emperor has fallen. What should we do? All sorts of roars and shouts reverberated on the 9 giant peaks. Divine King Yunque was dumbfounded. His eyes widened in disbelief and he looked extremely sorrowful. The 4 commander-in-chief and many other generals could not accept this outcome. Some were wailing, some were pounding their chests and stamping their feet, and some were sighing. As for the more than 50,000 soldiers, they were in a myriad of different states and had different reactions. However, everyone knew that the sky had fallen. Ji Tianxing looked down at everything in the star-cloud world from the perspective of heaven, and calmly looked at the tens of thousands of soldiers. He naturally had his reasons for doing this. If he had appeared in the star-cloud world and announced to the 50,000 soldiers as the victor that Dao Xingyun had fallen and ordered them to surrender immediately, the outcome would have been different. The result was easy to imagine. The 50,000 soldiers definitely wouldn't believe this sudden shocking news. They would definitely rise up and counterattack. Although he could easily kill the 50,000 soldiers. However, his purpose was not to kill all of those soldiers. Instead, it was to incorporate them into his army. Therefore, he chose to do it step by step. He first created a panicked and uneasy atmosphere so that the 50,000 soldiers would have a bad premonition and be mentally prepared. Immediately after, he used a light screen to let everyone know of Zhou Xian's death. At this moment, the 50,000 soldiers could accept this outcome more easily. They would only feel grief, panic, and fear. When the soldiers' emotions gradually calmed down, he would appear again and successfully take over the 50,000 soldiers. At that time, he would not need to waste a single soldier, nor would he need to fight or fight. Chapter 47:20. Things were developing according to Ji Tianxing's expectations. The 50,000 plus soldiers were agitated for an entire day. They used all sorts of methods to vent their grief and anger. After a day, the 50,000 plus people were exhausted and slowly calmed down. After Divine King Yunqua's emotions stabilized, he personally led the 4 commanders to pacify the soldiers. However, it was useless to do so now. Even they were not confident, so who would believe their words? Almost all the soldiers listened to them with a numb expression. Their eyes and expressions were gloomy. The nebula array disk belonged to Zhou Xian. Now that Zhou Xian was dead, no one could help them open the array disk. Therefore, all the soldiers would be trapped in the array disk and stay in the nebula world, helplessly waiting for an unknown fate. Unless they waited for the day when someone refined the nebula array disk, they would be able to reopen the nebula world. When that happened, they would most likely become the slaves of the array disk's new owner. This was everyone's fate. Everyone was well aware of it. Therefore, no matter what Divine King Yunque and the 4 commanders said, almost no one believed them. After an entire day, the dark clouds that shrouded the world dissipated. The world regained its light. More than 30,000 dazzling stars appeared high in the sky. The 50,000 plus soldiers were startled awake. They looked at the sky with nervous expressions and complicated emotions. They knew that they did not need to wait for too long. A new fate had arrived. Even Divine King Yunque thought of this point. He hurriedly wore his armor and carried his divine sword. He stood at the peak of the divine palace and looked up at the sky. Following that, the sky above the 9 peaks lit up with resplendent golden light. It was as dazzling as the sun. A towering figure appeared in the golden sun and descended from the sky. More than 50,000 people's gazes were gathered on that figure. Everyone knew that it was an expert. It was definitely the new owner of the nebula array disk. Only people who had refined the nebula array disk could enter and exit the nebula world freely. After 10 breaths, the figure that was 10,000 feet tall and was enveloped in golden light stopped above the 9 peaks. He stood in the sky like a deep pool and looked down at all the soldiers on the 9 peaks. Everyone was stunned when they saw his appearance and they all looked puzzled. Many Divine Lord Realm and Divine King Realm soldiers were discussing secretly through voice transmissions. Is this the person who refined God Emperor's disk array? Why isn't this guy from the Desolate race? The murderer who killed the God Emperor is a Desolate race expert, and the person who controls the disk array is from a foreign race. Could it be that after the fall of the God Emperor, the disk array was lost somewhere else and was picked up by this person? There was no doubt that Ji Tianxing had appeared in his true appearance and not in the image of Yi Jingfeng. Almost none of the soldiers recognized him. Only God King Yunque and the 2 commanders remained. Their eyes widened as they stared at Ji Tianxing. Their faces were filled with horror as their bodies began to tremble. Obviously, they recognized Ji Tianxing's identity, but they found it hard to accept this result. It's actually him. How could it be him? Isn't he still in the God realm? Why is he here? Some of the surrounding generals could not help but ask when they noticed God King Yunque and the 2 commanders' odd expressions. Lord Commanders, what's the matter? Lord God King, do you know this foreign race expert? Upon hearing the generals' inquiries, God King Yunque and the 2 commanders revealed bitter expressions. Know him? How can we just know him? This fellow is the enemy of the God Emperor. They have a blood feud. Although you do not know this foreign race expert, you must have heard of his name. He is the Kenshin from years ago. When the surrounding generals heard this answer, everyone was appalled. Countless of them stared with widened eyes as they revealed looks of disbelief. Kenshin. He is the legendary Kenshin. The Kenshin that died more than 1,000 years ago and was killed by the God Emperor? Heavens! Why would he appear here? Kenshin. How did he obtain the disk array? We're doomed. We're all going to die. At this moment, cries of alarm could be heard from the various peaks. The name, Kenshin, quickly spread among the crowd. causing countless generals and soldiers to tremble in fear. There was a commotion on a few peaks. Some of the generals and soldiers were even filled with fear and instinctively wanted to run away. However, under the persuasion of their companions, they quickly calmed down. They thought about it carefully. What was the use of running away? Even if they escaped the 9 peaks, could they escape the nebula world? The nebula array disk array had been refined by Xianxia. Where else could they escape to? Hence, after a commotion, the generals and soldiers on the various peaks gradually calmed down. Xianxia looked down at the 9 peaks indifferently and did not speak for a long time. When over 50,000 generals and soldiers had calmed down, he said, "I believe everyone already knows that Zhou Xian has died and the nebula array disk has changed owners. That's right, I am the new owner of the nebula array disk. As for why this is the result, you don't need to know. You only need to understand that there are only 2 paths in front of you now. One is to submit to me. The other is to be killed by me and be buried with Zhou Xian." The low and majestic voice reverberated among the 9 peaks. It was like a heavy hammer that pounded on everyone's hearts. The majesty of the God Emperor spread out and covered a radius of 10,000 miles. Over 50,000 generals and soldiers trembled under the majesty. They were filled with fear and could not help but gather together and hug each other. It was as if they could already see the scene where the cold and heartless Xianxia waved his hand and scattered sword light over 10,000 miles, killing everyone and cutting them into pieces. Under the threat of death, the will of most of the generals and soldiers had already been shaken. At this moment, Xianxia continued, "I believe all of you know that Zhou Xian and I have a blood feud. However, now that Zhou Xian is dead, the feud between us has been resolved. There is no enmity between you and me. After you submit to me, as long as you work loyally and obey my orders, I will not be biased and will not treat you unfairly." These words were reasonable. When the tens of thousands of generals and soldiers heard this, they felt more at ease. Many people had the same thought. If Zhou Xian was still alive, they could still maintain their loyalty. Even if they were suppressed by a strong enemy, they could still sacrifice themselves. However, Zhou Xian was already dead. Who could they be loyal to? If they would rather die than submit or even go against Xianxia to avenge Zhou Xian, that would not be loyalty. It would be foolish loyalty and stubbornness. Therefore, a group of generals and soldiers quickly expressed their loyalty to Xianxia. With people taking the lead to surrender, naturally more generals and soldiers followed suit. Chapter 47:21. Soon over 30,000 soldiers on the 9 giant peaks expressed their allegiance to Xianxia. As for the remaining 20,000 soldiers as well as the 4 commanders and Divine King Yunque, they were still hesitating and observing. These soldiers were considered Zhou Xian's direct subordinates. They were even more loyal to Zhou Xian. They looked at the 4 commanders and Divine King Yunque to see what choice they would make. Xianxia's gaze also landed on Divine King Yunque. He did not say a word. His gaze was cold as he looked at Divine King Yunque with a dignified aura. It exerted immense pressure on him. At that moment, Divine King Yunque was in a state of internal conflict. Not only was he enduring everyone's gazes, he was also experiencing immense torment inwardly. Everyone knew that he was Zhou Xian's final disciple. At such a moment of life and death, the other soldiers could be selfish and choose to surrender for survival. Even so, no one would scold them for being disloyal. But Divine King Yunque could not. Even if Zhou Xian was already dead as his final disciple, he absolutely could not surrender to Xianxia. Everything he had today was bestowed upon him by Zhou Xian. Zhou Xian had been killed by an expert. He should be buried with Zhou Xian to be worthy of his master's nurturing. Divine King Yunque naturally understood this logic. However, he did not wish to die. He had experienced so many hardships in his life before finally arriving at the planet of origins, the origin of all things in the world. It was the final sacred ground that hid the mystery of eternal life. He had hopes of breaking through to the God Emperor realm here. He also had hopes of coming into contact with the mystery of eternal life. For him to give up his life for his deceased master, that was too difficult. He was in a dilemma. He was hesitant about his choice. If he refused to surrender, he could preserve his reputation for loyalty, but his life's efforts would be for naught. Furthermore, the tens of thousands of soldiers could surrender and live. Why should he be the only one to be buried with Zhou Xian? If he surrendered to Xianxia, he could naturally live. In the future he would have a chance of breaking through to the God-Emperor realm. However, the tens of thousands of soldiers would definitely criticize him behind his back and label him with all sorts of bad names. Difficult. It was too difficult. At this moment Yun Kuo wished that he was not making a choice in front of everyone. He would rather fight on the battlefield where his life and death were up to the heavens. The incomparable pressure and the choice between life and death made Yun Kuo turn nervous. His back was drenched in cold sweat. Fortunately, Ji Tianxing said something at this moment. Every living being has the right to live. Compared to life and death, other things might not be that important. It was this sentence that caused the 20,000 soldiers who were still watching to stiffen, revealing thoughtful expressions. It also made the hesitant God King Yun Kuo finally make up his mind. He closed his eyes and made his decision. Lord Kenshin, I, God King Yun Kuo, am willing to submit. Although it was only a sentence, a short 16 words, it seemed to have used up all of his strength. After saying the word, submit, Divine King Yun Kuo seemed to have obtained relief as he let out a long sigh. As for the 4 commanders and the 20,000 soldiers, they withdrew their gazes and revealed complicated expressions. Of course, there were people who despised Divine King Yun Kuo for his cowardice. However, there were also many soldiers who heaved a sigh of relief as they revealed expressions of relief. In fact, while Divine King Yun Kuo was hesitating and in a dilemma, how could they not be tormented and wavering? Thankfully, Divine King Yun Kuo finally made his choice. Even if there was infamy, he had to shoulder it all alone. Everyone was happy. After Divine King Yun Kuo announced his submission, the 4 commanders did not hesitate as they also expressed their submission to Ji Tianxing. The 20,000 soldiers also had nothing to say as they obediently expressed their loyalty. Although there were some who were more stubborn and were unwilling to surrender, they gave up after being persuaded by their companions. In this way, Ji Tianxing used less than an hour to subdue more than 50,000 elite soldiers under Dao Xingyun. Of course, these soldiers only submitted verbally. They might still be conflicted in their hearts. However, Ji Tianxing did not have the patience, nor did he have the time to slowly influence the soldiers and make them serve him willingly. He used the simplest and crudest method to ensure everyone's loyalty. It was the same old rules. Both the ordinary and the evolved version of the Heavenly Tao Oath were given. The ordinary version of the Heavenly Tao Oath was prepared for the 50,000 soldiers. The more detailed evolved version was prepared for Divine King Yun Kuo, the 4 commanders and the 20+ generals. Under Ji Tianxing's suppression, everyone followed the corresponding Heavenly Tao Oath and recited it together. After everyone finished reciting the Heavenly Tao Oath, they saw an unforgettable scene. The entire nebula world was covered by a worldly phenomenon. The sky for billions of miles was filled with thunderbolts and divine flames. Everyone was dizzy from the continuous rumbling of thunder. When everyone swore a Heavenly Tao Oath, it would cause a worldly phenomenon. It would summon a scene of lightning and divine flames filling the sky. And when more than 50,000 people swore together, the outcome was imaginable. The worldly phenomenon lasted for 2 full days before dissipating. After recruiting the 50,000 soldiers, Ji Tianxing left the nebula world. He did not assign any missions to the soldiers, nor did he have many requests. However, before he left, he gave Divine King Yun Kuo an order and assigned a mission. The mission was very simple. It was to get Divine King Yun Kuo to pacify the soldiers and allow them to resume their normal cultivation as soon as possible, as well as conserve their energy. In the future, when he needed these tens of thousands of soldiers, he hoped that Divine King Yun Kuo could produce an army with strict discipline and outstanding combat strength. If this request was not met, it would not be Ji Tianxing who would be harmed but themselves. After all, soldiers were trained for 1,000 days to be used in a single moment. Once they were needed in battle, it would definitely be a life-and-death battle. Ji Tianxing had once thought of splitting up Dao Xingyun's 50,000 soldiers and combining them with his 50,000 soldiers to form 2 armies. Then he would let the generals under his command these 2 armies to ensure the loyalty of the army. However, doing so would be a waste of time. It would also cause the 2 armies to have prejudices against each other, resulting in many conflicts. Even if there were commanders and generals to suppress them, the 2 armies that appeared united on the surface would not be able to unleash their greatest combat strength. Rather than that, it was better to leave things as they were. The soldiers under Dao Xingyun were still under the command of Divine King Yun Kuo and the 4 commanders. This would be more cohesive. And the only difficulty was left to Ji Tianxing to resolve. That was, when and under what circumstances to use Divine King Yunqua's army was extremely important. After settling these trivial matters, Ji Tianxing returned to the distorted spacetime and cultivated in seclusion for a few years. Then he left the distorted spacetime and returned to the god-slaying battleship. According to his calculations, the god-slaying battleship had already reached the east of the Taiyu Shrine. It would not be long before it crossed the border. Chapter 47-22. In the past few months, Ji Tianxing was relieved to have Bai Long drive the warship through the Taiyu Shrine's territory. But after arriving at the border and before leaving the Taiyu Shrine, he still had to personally oversee the operation. After all, he couldn't be sure if the Taiyu Shrine's hall masters would come after him. In the Taiyu Shrine's territory, he had to take the divine warship to travel. And the hall masters could use the teleportation array of each shrine to travel the distance that he would take 2 months to travel in a day. He had possessed Yi Jingfeng and followed Qianzhan for a long time. He knew the Taiyu Shrine's situation quite well. Each shrine had built a teleportation array, but it was only activated a few times. Each time it was activated, it would cost an astronomical amount of cultivation resources. Ji Tianxing couldn't be sure how determined the Taiyu Shrine was. The furious first hall master couldn't bear to use 3 years' worth of tributes to activate those teleportation arrays. Swoosh! With a flash of divine light, Ji Tianxing appeared in the cockpit of the Godslayer warship. Bai Long was controlling the warship's array, carefully concealing his whereabouts and aura, and vigilantly observing the surroundings. He had followed his master for so many years. He knew his master's nature and knew when to do what. Seeing his master appear, he hurriedly bowed and greeted, "Disciple greets master." Ji Tianxing nodded slightly in response and asked, "Have you arrived at the Dongchen Hall?" Bai Long nodded and answered, "Master, I entered the Dongchen Hall last night. I'm currently rushing to the center of the Dongchen Hall. I'll cross the Dongchen Hall in about 4 days." Ji Tianxing calmly analyzed, the Dongchen Hall is in the Taiyu Shrine's territory. It's located in the easternmost area. After crossing the Dongchen Hall, you'll leave the Taiyu Shrine and enter the unknown. I wonder if the Taiyu Shrine's hall masters can guess my route. I'm heading east. With Lord Hallmaster's wisdom combined with the secrets Dao Xingyun told him, he should be able to guess that I'm going to the east and that my next target is the Pantheon of Immortality, right? At this point he crossed his arms in front of his chest and rubbed his chin with his right hand. He continued to speculate. If the hall masters came to chase after me on the divine ship, they definitely wouldn't be able to catch up. Let's see if the first hall master has the courage to get the other halls to use the teleportation arrays of their respective halls to rush to the Dongchen Hall to kill me. Bai Long listened to his master's analysis and was filled with worry. He asked tentatively, "Master, this is unlikely, right? Although the Dongchen Hall is a place we must pass through on our way to the east, the Dongchen Hall is too vast. We only have one divine ship and we can conceal our tracks and auras. Even if they wanted to intercept us, I'm afraid it would be very difficult for them to find us, right?" Ji Tianxing nodded slightly and said, "Logically speaking, that is the case. However, we cannot underestimate the head hallmaster's determination and the Taiyu Shrine's power. You must know that the Taiyu Shrine is very likely the most powerful of the 4 great sacred halls. The hall masters will be the main force to kill us, but there are thousands of elite divine kings who will listen to their orders and commands." Bai Long nodded to show that he understood. After hearing Master's words, "Your disciple feels that the Taiyu Shrine will not give up so easily. It is very likely that they have set up traps and ambushes in the Dongchen Hall. We must be extra careful for the next few days." Ji Tianxing patted his shoulder and comforted him. "Being careful and vigilant is a must, but there is no need to be too nervous. Focus on piloting the warship. Your master will investigate the situation in advance. Although the hall masters are not weak, your master will be on guard. It will be difficult for them to succeed." Hearing these words, White Dragon felt a little comforted and he felt a little more confident. In the next 2 days, the master and disciple remained vigilant as they hurried through the Dongchen Hall. Bai Long piloted the warship while Ji Tianxing sat cross-legged behind him. He seemed to be resting with his eyes closed, but in reality his divine sense was fully spread out to investigate the situation within a radius of 100,000 li. For 2 whole days Ji Tianxing did not stop for a single moment. Although the journey was very smooth and they did not encounter any danger or discover any suspicious clues, he did not let down his guard. For some reason, the closer they got to the central region of the Dongchen Hall, the more uneasy he felt. In a few more hours the God-Slayer worship would be close to the headquarters of the Dongchen Hall. At this time, Ji Tianxing's mind gradually began to sense the premonition of danger. The sudden impulse, the early warning of danger, and the revelation of the heavenly Tao that had not appeared in a long time had appeared once more. Over the years, the revelation of the heavenly Tao had appeared several times. Each time, it had alerted him when his life was in danger. But this time, when the revelation of the heavenly Tao appeared, Ji Tianxing firmly believed that there would be a life-or-death situation ahead. Even though the revelation of the heavenly Tao was just a mysterious premonition and did not have a concrete image, he could not use the revelation to deduce what kind of danger it was, or which experts were lying in ambush for him. But the revelation of the heavenly Tao meant that his life was in danger. In other words, the people who had set up the ambush ahead had a very high chance of killing him. Without any hesitation, Ji Tianxing immediately ordered Bai Long. Bai Long turned southeast. Bai Long and him already had enough tacit understanding. After hearing the order, Bai Long did not ask for any reason and immediately began to carry it out. The God-Slayer warship immediately adjusted its direction and flew southeast. This way they should be able to avoid the danger zone around the headquarters of the Dongchen Hall as much as possible. But this matter did not end there. The revelation of the heavenly Tao and the early warning of danger were still circling in Ji Tianxing's mind. His expression was as calm as water as he silently analyzed. 4th Palace Master, 5th Palace Master and 6th Palace Master. Although I have not fought with them before, I followed Qianzhan to see them in the Grand Universe Mystic Realm. Logically speaking, with their strength and methods, it is unlikely that they can kill me. The 3rd Palace Master is also in the middle stage of the God Emperor realm, and has 2 more Taoist rhymes than me. At most he can defeat me, but it is impossible for him to kill me. After analyzing to this point, his eyes suddenly lit up, and the look in his eyes became sharper. It's the 2nd Palace Master. He is in the upper stage of the God Emperor realm, and it is said that he has condensed 7 Taoist rhymes. Only he can pose a threat to my life. The 1st Palace Master is really ruthless. In order to kill me, he actually sent out 5 Palace Masters. Ji Tianxing was almost certain that 5 of the 6 Palace Masters of the Taiyu Shrine had been sent out. That was the only way to kill him. I wonder if the 1st Palace Master is going through so much trouble to avenge Dao Xingyun, or to save the Taiyu Shrine's face. Is Dao Xingyun really that important in the 1st Palace Master's eyes? As these thoughts flashed through his mind, his fear of the Taiyu Shrine and the 1st Palace Master deepened. Chapter 47-23. The Dongchen Hall was a place Ji Tianxing had to pass by on his way to the Pantheon of Immortality. However, the Dongchen Hall's territory was vast enough. Even if he was close to the Dongchen Hall's headquarters, he only needed to fly a few 100 million miles southeast to avoid the danger zone. In fact, even without the warning from the heavenly Tao, he would not let the god-slaying battleship fly past the Dongchen Hall's headquarters. He would still take a detour. Although he was confident, he was not arrogant. He had to be responsible for his friends and soldiers. Otherwise, Dao Xingyun and his 50,000 soldiers were the best example. Even though the god-slaying battleship had taken a detour, Ji Tianxing still released his divine sense to check his surroundings. Only when the warning from the heavenly Tao dissipated would it mean that he was out of danger. Of course, as time passed, the sense of danger in his mind gradually weakened. This meant that he was gradually getting away from the danger zone. The direction and method were both correct. Next, he would need some time. 14 hours later, the god-slaying battleship had traveled more than 100 million miles southeast. At this time, the warning from the heavenly Tao had basically dissipated. Ji Tianxing ordered the White Dragon to change direction and fly east. Although this detour would waste half a day of time, safety was the most important thing. However, safety came first. The best outcome would be to avoid being killed by the temple masters of the Cosmos Temple. The situation in the cockpit was the same as before. The White Dragon controlled the direction and speed of the battleship. Ji Tianxing sat cross-legged in the middle and released his divine sense to monitor the surroundings. The master and disciple both thought that the battleship had escaped the danger zone and should be safe. In 2 or 3 days they would be able to leave the Dongchen Hall and enter the unknown. No matter how determined the Taiyu Shrine was, no matter how powerful they were, they could not chase them into the unknown, right? As time passed, the sense of danger in Ji Tianxing's mind gradually dissipated and did not appear again. However, at noon on the second day something unexpected happened. The god-slaying battleship was flying over a vast mountain range, passing through the white clouds invisibly. Ji Tianxing's divine sense had been covering an area of 100,000 miles, searching for any anomalies in the surroundings. Suddenly, he sensed a vague fluctuation of god power coming from the peak of a towering mountain 90,000 miles to his left. Although there were many mountains, rivers and lakes within the Dongchen Hall's territory, there were also many birds and beasts that lived there. During the journey, Ji Tianxing detected the aura and traces of divine beasts and ferocious beasts more than once. However, the divine power fluctuation that he sensed this time was different from before. He was certain that it was not the divine power fluctuations of birds or beasts, but the aura of a formation. This was the wilderness, so how could there be a formation here? Therefore, Ji Tianxing's first reaction was that the strong men of the Taiyu Shrine had set up an ambush nearby. The formation at the peak of the mountain was either a trap or it was set up to track him down. He hurriedly ordered the white dragon to change its direction and take a detour away from the divine array. He knew very well that the aura of the divine array proved that it was a supreme-grade king-level divine array and not an emperor-grade one. If it was not an emperor-grade divine array, it would not be a threat to him and the god-slaying battleship. However, he was careful and ordered the battleship to stay away from the area. After 20 breaths, the god-slaying battleship went around the divine array and gradually moved away. Ji Tianxing used his divine sense to scan an area of 100,000 miles. Seeing that there was nothing unusual, he was relieved. However, after 10 breaths, a dazzling starlight appeared behind the god-slaying battleship. It was like a meteor streaking across the sky. Swoosh! The meteor was extremely fast. It crossed tens of thousands of miles in an instant and arrived behind the god-slaying battleship. The two were less than 80,000 miles apart. At this time, Ji Tianxing was already alert. He hurriedly released his divine sense to investigate. The results shocked him and made him feel incredulous. The meteor was a battleship, and it was an emperor-grade battleship. According to the insignia on the battleship, it was clearly a battleship of the Taiyu Shrine. Moreover, it was the battleship of one of the shrine masters. Damn it! Why would the shrine masters of the Taiyu Shrine set up an ambush here? We have already gone around 100 million miles. How could we still meet them? Isn't this too much of a coincidence? Ji Tianxing furrowed his brows as a cold light flashed in his eyes. He could not be sure if the other party was too lucky or if the other party was astute and had guessed his route. Bai Long was also very surprised. He whispered, even if the shrine masters of the Taiyu Shrine could reach the Dongchen Hall a few months in advance, they would have enough time to set up an inescapable trap. However, we have already gone around 100 million miles and are far away from the headquarters of the Dongchen Hall. How could we still meet them? Could it be that they predicted that we would take a detour, so they did not set up an ambush at the headquarters of the Dongchen Hall? Instead, they set up traps and defensive lines within 100 million miles on both sides? Did the Cosmos Temple predict what we would do? In fact, if we passed by the headquarters of the Dongchen Hall directly, we would not be discovered. Ji Tianxing heard his words and raised his eyebrows. Predicted our plan? Your words make sense. Perhaps that is the case. However, I am sure that this is not the idea of the third shrine master, fourth, fifth, and sixth shrine masters. Only the second shrine master and the first shrine master have such strategy and courage. Bai Long nodded and said, Master, no matter who is chasing us from behind, we cannot be entangled with them. I believe that guy has already spread the news. The other shrine masters must be leading an army and are coming to surround us. Now we can only go as fast as we can and try to enter the unknown place as soon as possible. Am I right? Ji Tianxing nodded slightly and ordered, don't hesitate to use any resources and go all out. You only need to control the warship. I will deal with them. Then the master and disciple began to work together. Bai Long controlled the array and increased the speed of the god-slaying warship to the limit. He also controlled the warship's direction and trajectory, ready to dodge the enemy's attack at any time. Xianxia used his divine sense to cover a radius of 100,000 miles to monitor the situation in case there were reinforcements. At the same time, he controlled the offensive array of the warship and activated the 360 divine cannons on the warship, locking onto the warship that was chasing them relentlessly. As he poured divine power into the array, the 360 divine cannons were activated. The cannons lit up with divine light, accumulating power that could destroy heaven and earth. Boom! In the next moment, the god-slaying warship let out a deafening roar that resounded through the sky. The 360 divine cannons spewed out divine light that could destroy heaven and earth at the same time, blasting toward the divine warship behind them. The heaven and earth within a radius of tens of thousands of miles were illuminated, and the air seemed to have solidified. More than 300 pillars of light blasted out at the same time. Even the mountains within a radius of tens of thousands of miles were blasted into ruins. Chapter 47:24. The divine warship behind them was about to be hit by the pillars of light. It was chasing after the god-slaying battleship at full speed. It was equivalent to charging into more than 300 pillars of light. As a result, its reaction time, which was only an instant, was reduced by half. At this critical moment, it had no time to dodge. It could only withstand the flashing green defensive shield and slam into the 300 pillars of light. Boom! Crack! An earth-shattering sound rang out, resounding through the clouds and shaking the world. The huge explosion spread for hundreds of thousands of miles. The destructive shockwave, wrapped in billions of divine light fragments, shot out in all directions, destroying the surrounding mountains and forests. The towering mountains, the green forests, the 1,000-foot-tall ancient trees, and the winding rivers were all turned into ruins under the five-colored divine light, leaving only pieces of barren land. With the divine warship as the center, a radius of 50,000 miles turned into a huge crater. The surrounding 50,000 miles were affected. Smoke and dust covered everything, and the raging wind did not dissipate for a long time. The Emperor-level battleship that was hit by more than 300 divine lights was not unscathed. Its defensive shield was still shattered, and a few cracks appeared on the surface of the battleship. For nearly 10,000 years, the divine warship had never suffered such damage. The last time it was injured was 10,000 years ago, when the ancient sea beasts in the Chaos Sea broke its defense. Although such cracks and wounds were not a big deal to the Emperor-level battleship. However, the shattering of the battleship's defensive shield and the cracks on the surface of the battleship still had a great impact on morale. At least the 1,000 elite godly kings on the battleship were no longer as arrogant and domineering as before. They also did not dare to underestimate the enemy. In the cockpit, the high-spirited and agitated second palace master also calmed down. It was just as the White Dragon had said. The reason why he had appeared in this area and set up so many array formations nearby was because he had been instructed by the first palace master. A few months ago, after the first palace master and he arrived at the Dongchen Hall, they had gathered several palace masters for several meetings. Although the Dongchen Hall branch was the only route Xianxia had to pass through to escape, the territory of the Dongchen Hall branch was too large. Even though the Taiyu Shrine's hall masters had mobilized over 10,000 elite god kings, they were still unable to form a defensive line that was hundreds of millions of miles long. The palace masters discussed this matter 6 times, each of them holding their own opinions and arguing endlessly. In the end, it was the first palace master who made the final decision. They gave up on the region of 40 million kilometers around the Dongchen branch headquarters, leaving only the Dongchen branch master and his 4,000 elite god kings to guard this region. The 6 hall masters each led 1,000 elite god kings and were stationed at the north and south of the Dongchen Hall's headquarters, 40 million miles away. With regards to the head hall master's decision, the other hall masters expressed that they did not understand. They also expressed their concerns and opposition. However, the Lord Hall Master claimed that the other party was the strongest of the 5 god emperors, and that he was very shrewd and scheming. With their intelligence, they would definitely be able to guess that if the Taiyu Shrine wanted to carry out an interception operation, it would be impossible for them to pass through the headquarters of the Dongchen branch. That would be no different from walking right into a trap. Therefore, the Great Hall Master predicted that the culprit would avoid the Dongchen branch headquarters. He was predicting the culprit's judgment and had ample time to prepare. The Hall Masters suddenly understood. Even if they were still worried, they could only carry out the Great Hall Master's orders. In a few months, they madly built traps and formations to set up an inescapable net. Now, when the second Palace Master recalled the Great Hall Master's firm attitude and decision, he only felt that the Great Hall Master was wise and wise. He was really admirable. At this time, an armored commander entered the cockpit and reported the results to the second Palace Master. Lord Hall Master, there are 2 cracks on the right flank of the battleship. They are 5 feet long and 2 feet deep. In addition, there is a dent in the middle of the left cord. I'm afraid it's in danger of breaking. The second Palace Master nodded slightly to show that he understood. He ordered in a dignified tone, "Repair it immediately and restore it to its original state as soon as possible. Do not affect the upcoming battle." The commander immediately bowed and said, "Yes, sir," before turning around and leaving. The second Palace Master ordered the guards not far behind him, "Pass my order to the 3rd and 4th teams. Immediately activate the divine cannons and prepare to attack and counterattack." Although the deity-slaying battleship was invisible, the second Palace Master's divine sense was powerful. He had already discovered the deity-slaying battleship and locked onto its position. In his opinion, the deity-slaying battleship had to disperse its power to conceal itself, which would definitely affect its speed. He wanted to wait for the other party to reveal their original state before giving the order to attack. However, he did not expect the other party to be so arrogant and attack his battleship first. How could he tolerate this? Of course, he ordered the divine cannons to be on standby. Currently, the deity-slaying battleship was still invisible. Only he could lock onto the other party's position. As long as the other party's battleship revealed itself, he would immediately give the order to counterattack. Swoosh. With the power of the previous bombardment, the deity-slaying battleship took the opportunity to increase the distance between them. When the second Palace Master's battleship returned to normal and continued the chase, the distance between them had increased to 100,000 miles. At this time, Ji Tianxing's divine sense detected that the enemy had also activated the divine cannons. Divine light flashed in the cannons. Apparently, they were accumulating power. He quickly reminded the white dragon to hide its aura and avoid being locked onto by the enemy. A round of bombardment from the deity-slaying battleship could damage the enemy's battleship. Similarly, a round of bombardment from the enemy's battleship could also damage the deity-slaying battleship. Most importantly, the deity-slaying battleship that he had refined was not considered top-notch among Emperor-level divine artifacts. It could only be considered mid-grade. The quality of the enemy's battleship was very likely to be a high-level Emperor-level divine artifact. Once the deity-slaying battleship was bombarded by the enemy, it would only suffer more damage. Therefore, the deity-slaying battleship could stop attacking the enemy's battleship, but it could not be hit by the enemy. Just like this, the 2 divine battleships sped through the sky and began a chase. In order to avoid being locked onto by the enemy's battleship and being bombarded, the deity-slaying battleship had been concealing its tracks and not revealing its aura. There was no effect in a short period of time, but as time passed, the drawbacks became obvious. The deity-slaying battleship had to escape while remaining invisible and concealing its aura. This would definitely consume more cultivation resources. Moreover, the maximum speed of the battleship was also affected and could not be fully unleashed. The second Palace Master's battleship was indeed of a higher grade than the deity-slaying battleship. Its speed was also slightly faster. Therefore, after 15 minutes, the second Palace Master's battleship approached the deity-slaying battleship. The 2 were less than 15,000 miles apart. The elite divine kings under the second Palace Master's command could not lock onto the deity-slaying battleship and could not attack. However, the second Palace Master's divine sense had locked onto the deity-slaying battleship. He decisively took out 2 6-pointed star-shaped Emperor-level divine artifacts and attacked the deity-slaying battleship. Swoosh, swoosh. After the shining silver 6-pointed star flew out of the battleship, it expanded to the size of a mountain in the sky. It was like 2 dazzling stars as it bombarded the deity-slaying battleship. The terrifying power caused the sky to change color and the wind to howl. Chapter 47-25. When the two stars appeared, Ji Tianxing had already sensed that something was wrong. However, the two divine battleships were too close to each other. The two stars were close to 5,000 kilometers in diameter. The moment they appeared, they closed in on the god-slaying battleship, giving it no chance to dodge. At this critical moment, Ji Tianxing did not even have time to control the divine cannons of the divine battleship. He could only release a vast amount of divine power to form a huge shield of light behind the god-slaying battleship. Boom! Crack! Almost at the same time as the shield of light appeared, the two huge stars slammed into the dark golden shield of light, creating a deafening explosion. Instantly, the huge golden shield of light collapsed and golden fragments filled the sky. They rained down on the ground. The violent force wreaked havoc. The speed and power of the two stars were greatly reduced, but they still hit the god-slaying battleship. Boom! Boom! A muffled boom burst out, spreading to a distance of 100,000 miles between heaven and earth. The divine power shockwave, which was enough to destroy everything, spread out in all directions along with countless fragments of starlight. With the god-slaying battleship as the center, the mountains and land within 50,000 kilometers were destroyed, turning into deep craters and ruins. How could the god-slaying battleship remain undamaged under such terrifying power? Not only was the shield of the god-slaying battleship shattered, but the surface of the god-slaying battleship also had two dents and a crack. The violent force of the shockwave sent the god-slaying battleship flying for more than 5,000 kilometers. It spun dozens of times in the sky. In the end, the god-slaying battleship managed to neutralize the force of the shockwave and barely managed to stop in the sky. It did not crash into the mountain below. However, the Deputy Palace Master's divine battleship caught up again, closing the distance between them to 5,000 kilometers. The god-slaying battleship, which had just suffered a heavy blow, had its array power disrupted. It could not remain invisible or conceal its aura. As a result, the god-slaying battleship's figure flickered in the sky, its aura flickering. Taking advantage of this opportunity, the divine cannons in the Deputy Palace Master's divine battleship immediately locked onto the god-slaying battleship and fired without hesitation. Boom! More than 300 divine cannons fired at the same time, releasing dazzling divine power light beams that blasted toward the god-slaying battleship. At this moment, the world was blinding white. The divine power light was so dazzling that it was hard to open one's eyes. A destructive aura filled the world and locked onto the god-slaying battleship. The White Dragon had been on the god-slaying battleship for many years. He had been traveling, but most of the time he was in a hurry. He rarely piloted a warship to fight with the enemy's warships. He also lacked the corresponding experience. He had managed to stabilize the tumbling god-slaying battleship with great difficulty. Now he was being bombarded by the second Hallmaster's ship. He had no time to react or dodge. The god-slaying battleship was the god-slaying battleship. Was the god-slaying divine battleship was divine. The god-slaying divine was divine, it was divine slaying whoosh. With a flash of white light, the god-slaying battleship disappeared from the sky, leaving Ji Tianxing alone. If he had enough time, he could use the ultimate skill, so close, yet worlds apart, and teleport 50,000 kilometers away. However, the distance between the two parties was too close. Being able to put away the god-slaying battleship before the 300 light pillars struck it was already his limit. Next, all he could do was activate his majestic divine power and form a divine shield. Boom! At the same time, the pillars of light engulfed his figure, causing an earth-shattering explosion. Even though the divine power shield he condensed was very strong, it could not withstand the fierce bombardment of more than 300 light pillars and was shattered on the spot. The terrifying impact sent him flying like a cannonball, crashing into the ruins thousands of miles away. The ruins within a radius of tens of thousands of miles were once again swept away by the violent shockwaves, and another 1,000 feet of the ground was scraped away. Ji Tianxing flew backward for over 10,000 miles amidst the smoke and dust and finally stopped in midair. However, his complexion was pale, his long hair was slightly disheveled, and his divine power aura was slightly chaotic and fluctuating. Even though he was not severely injured, he still felt very uncomfortable after taking such a blow. At this moment, the second palace master was standing in the control room of the battleship. His divine consciousness locked onto Ji Tianxing, who was in the smoke and dust. Looking at the 8-foot-tall human youth with black hair and white robes, he narrowed his eyes and a cold light flashed in his eyes. "So this is your true face?" The second palace master had long known that a certain god emperor from the god realm had possessed Yi Jingfeng, who was under Qian Zhan's command, and had plotted to kill Dao Xingyun. However, before this he had never met Yi Jingfeng. This was the first time he had seen the murderer's true face. He remembered Ji Tianxing's appearance and Ji Tianxing's divine soul aura. From now on, no matter who Ji Tianxing possessed or what he became, he would be able to recognize him based on the divine soul aura of Ji Tianxing. "He's already injured. We can't let him escape. Kill him as soon as possible." The second palace master stared coldly at Ji Tianxing and gave the order to the soldiers operating the battleship. Therefore his battleship accelerated again and charged toward Ji Tianxing. More than 300 divine cannons lit up with divine light again, accumulating terrifying power, and were ready to blast Ji Tianxing to death. This time Ji Tianxing finally had enough time to prepare. He immediately used the ultimate skill, so close yet so far. Zhoosh! A familiar scene appeared again. With a flash of white light, Ji Tianxing disappeared from where he stood. In the next moment he crossed 120,000 miles of space and appeared in the distant sky in front of him. Almost at the same time, more than 300 divine cannons on the second palace master's battleship shot out more than 300 dazzling divine light beams, and blasted toward the spot where Ji Tianxing had been. However, the result was obvious. The divine power light pillars that filled the sky shot out, but they all landed on empty air and heavily bombarded the ground. The ground, which was already in ruins, was blasted into a huge crater and dust flew up into the sky. In the pilot house of the battleship, the second palace master looked at the smoke and dust in the sky. His divine consciousness extended more than 100,000 miles away, and he was still locked onto Ji Tianxing. His mouth was slightly open and he almost exclaimed. His face was full of shock and disbelief. He dodged it, teleported more than 100,000 miles in an instant. He has mastered such a powerful divine power. These thoughts flashed through the second palace master's mind. His heart was in turmoil and he could not calm down. Of course, other than shock and surprise, the second palace master did not have any other emotions. He did not feel depressed or defeated. After all, as an expert in the upper state of God Emperor, he had mastered a similar divine power. Although he could not teleport more than 100,000 miles in a long period of time and at a high frequency like Ji Tianxing, he could teleport more than 100,000 miles. However, he could perform space diversion 2 or 3 times in a row in a short period of time, and each time he teleported more than 100,000 miles away. Chapter 47-26. Even though Ji Tianxing had escaped tens of thousands of miles away, the second palace master was still calm. He had no intention of keeping the battleship and chasing after Ji Tianxing alone. He ordered the soldiers to control the battleship to speed up and catch up with Ji Tianxing. The fact proved that the second palace master's battleship was indeed extraordinary. In just a few minutes, the battleship caught up with Ji Tianxing and the distance between them was shortened to 30,000 miles. At such a close distance, the battleship could already lock onto Ji Tianxing and could fire at any time. He was in a precarious situation. The more than 300 divine cannons on the second palace master's battleship lit up with divine light again. They accumulated terrifying power and were about to shoot out light pillars. At this critical moment, while Ji Tianxing was escaping, he was still able to release an earth-shattering divine power. Sword light filled the sky and smashed toward the second palace master's battleship. It was thousands of huge sword light beams with earth-shattering power. Boom! A deafening explosion spread across tens of thousands of miles. The defensive light shield of the second palace's flagship was blasted to pieces, exploding into fragments of godly light that filled the sky. The sword Dao divine power that Ji Tianxing had used had such terrifying power. The second palace master and the elite divine kings on the battleship were shocked and in disbelief. Especially the second palace master, who had a new understanding of Ji Tianxing's true combat power. Previously, I saw that this person was only at the middle level of God Emperor and had condensed 4 Taoist rhymes. I thought his strength was similar to 5th Palace Master and 6th Palace Master. Now it seems that this person's true strength is far above 5th Palace Master and 6th Palace Master. He is almost on par with the third palace master. No wonder he could escape from the third palace master's pursuit after killing Dao Xingyun in the War Dragon Divine Palace. The third palace master was also at the middle level of God Emperor and had condensed 6 Taoist rhymes. It was not an exaggeration to say that he was the most powerful middle-level God Emperor. However, Ji Tianxing, who had only condensed 4 Taoist rhymes, was on par with him. How could the second palace master not be shocked? Back then, the Lord Hall Master had analyzed all kinds of information and concluded that Ji Tianxing was most likely the chosen one they were looking for. The second palace master didn't think too much at that time. He just instinctively believed in the judgment of the first palace master and supported his decision. Now that he had personally exchanged blows with Ji Tianxing, he truly understood Ji Tianxing's strength. Only then did he realize that the first hall master's judgment was indeed sharp. The words of the first palace master flashed across the second palace master's mind, and he secretly made up his mind. This time, no matter what, we can't let him escape again. Even if we have to leave the Dongchen Hall and enter the unknown lands, even if we have to chase into the territory of the Pantheon of Immortality, we must capture him. As long as they could get the chosen one, the Taiyu Shrine would not hesitate to pay any price. Ji Tianxing used his sword Dao Theurgy to shatter the defensive light shield of the second palace master's flagship. This bought him some time. While the battleship reformed its defensive light shield and couldn't attack, he took the opportunity to widen the distance between them. Although the distance between them had increased to about 80,000 miles. Not long after, the battleship caught up with Ji Tianxing again, and the distance between them shortened to about 30,000 miles. This time the soldiers operating the battleship were experienced. They didn't wait for Ji Tianxing to cast spells to attack, and they took the lead to fire the cannons. Boom, boom, boom. More than 300 divine cannons lit up with divine light and shot out dazzling divine light beams. They locked onto Ji Tianxing's aura and blasted toward him fiercely. However, Ji Tianxing was already prepared. When the divine cannons lit up, he had already used his ultimate skill. So close yet so far. Swoosh. As the white light flashed, Ji Tianxing's figure disappeared from the sky. The next moment he appeared 120,000 miles away. The same scene played out. The more than 300 divine light beams blasted out by the battleship all missed. They destroyed the mountain range within a radius of tens of thousands of miles, turning it into a large ruin. This time the second palace master wasn't as shocked as before. He was just a little surprised. He muttered to himself, "Is there no limit to his space diversion theurgy? It's only been half an hour and he's already used it twice? Even if he's extraordinarily talented and has a strong foundation, he should have used up a lot of divine power and his combat power should have decreased." The second palace master calculated that if this situation continued, he estimated that in less than 2 hours, more than half of the opponent's divine power would be used up. At that time he would have to personally take action and capture the opponent. As time passed, the second palace master's flagship gradually caught up with Ji Tianxing again. Either Ji Tianxing used his ultimate skill and took the initiative to attack the battleship, or the second palace master's flagship opened its divine cannons and blasted out hundreds of divine light beams, and Ji Tianxing used his teleportation theurgy to dodge. The two parties chased and fought in the sky like this. The battle was quite intense. After a few exchanges, the same scene played out again and again. Ji Tianxing's divine power was greatly depleted, and his combat power was also decreasing quietly. Of course, the second palace master's flagship was also damaged. Not only did it consume a lot of resources, but it also required many divine kings to work together to repair it. The second palace master remained calm and composed as if he had a card up his sleeve. As he restrained Ji Tianxing so that he couldn't get rid of the entanglement, he also contacted the other palace masters to report his location and the route forward. Although he was very confident, he wasn't conceited or arrogant and he wouldn't act rashly. If he could wear down Ji Tianxing and capture him alone, that would naturally be the best result. Even if he couldn't, he wasn't in a hurry. He only needed to follow Ji Tianxing closely and stall for time. When the other palace masters arrived, they would join forces to encircle Ji Tianxing. It would be impossible for him to escape. Ji Tianxing, who had been flying at full speed ahead, also guessed the second palace master's intention and plan. If the second palace master was eager to make a contribution and wanted to defeat and capture him as soon as possible, Then he would have a chance to get rid of the second palace master unexpectedly. However, the second palace master was too calm. He wasn't in a hurry to capture him at all. He only followed him blindly and consumed his divine power. This made him helpless and his heart was filled with anxiety and worry. Unknowingly, 2 hours passed. During this time, Ji Tianxing and the second palace master's flagship constantly closed the distance between them, and repeatedly opened the distance between them. Both parties were getting closer and closer to the border of the Dongchen Hall. In at most 4 hours, they would leave the Taiyu Shrine's sphere of influence and enter the unknown land. At the same time, the other 5 palace masters were also on their way. According to the second palace master's prediction, the other palace masters would gather before entering the unknown land and complete the encirclement of Ji Tianxing. In such a situation, the second palace master's actions became more and more steady, and he was even more intelligent. He was neither arrogant nor rash. Ji Tianxing also realized that danger was approaching. He had to make a change. The second palace master has been chasing me for so long. The other palace masters must be on their way. If I continue to tangle with the second palace master, the other palace masters will be able to surround me in at most 4 to 6 hours. No. I have to change this situation and try to get rid of the second palace master. Only then can I leave successfully. Chapter 47:27. It was not easy to change the situation and get rid of the second palace master. If Ji Tianxing continued to run, he would only be able to get rid of the second palace master if he could perform so close, yet worlds apart 4 times in a row within 10 breaths. After all, the second palace master was an upper-level god emperor who had condensed 7 Taoist rhymes. Under normal circumstances, his divine consciousness should be able to detect at least 300,000 miles to 400,000 miles. Ji Tianxing could only get rid of the second palace master's divine consciousness if he could put a distance of 400,000 miles between him and the second palace master in a short period of time. But obviously, it was impossible for him to perform so close, yet worlds apart 4 times in a row within 10 breaths. Every time he performed this skill, it would consume a huge amount of divine power and cause a huge impact to his divine body. No matter how strong his divine body was, it would take him 15 minutes to dissolve it. If he performed so close, yet worlds apart 4 times in a row within 10 breaths, his meridians would be broken, his divine body would collapse, and his divine consciousness would be severely damaged. He would enter a weakened state. By then, even if he could get away from the second palace master, he would not be able to continue running. The second palace master would still catch up and catch him easily. This method would not work. Therefore, Ji Tianxing could only use another method, which was to fight the second palace master. On the surface, he looked the same as before. He was still flying in the sky and trying to get rid of the second palace master's ship. But in reality, the distance between him and the second palace master's ship was shrinking. He was silently accumulating divine power and wielding the sword of burial of heaven. His attention was on the second palace master's ship. Soon the distance between them was reduced to 20,000 miles. This was already a very dangerous distance. The second palace master guessed that Ji Tianxing would counterattack, so he let the divine ship fire first. But just as more than 300 divine cannons lit up and were accumulating divine power, Ji Tianxing suddenly turned around. He held the sword of burial of heaven with both hands and slashed at the second palace master's ship. The sword of apocalypse. Swoosh. At this moment, Ji Tianxing had absorbed the boundless power of the world and used all his strength to slash out a dazzling golden sword that was tens of thousands of feet long. Such an earth-shattering and terrifying sword move was Ji Tianxing's most powerful trump card, and he had never shown it in front of the second palace master. The second palace master's expression changed abruptly when the sword light lit up and the giant sword soared through the sky. His eyes widened and shone with an awe-inspiring light. The second palace master was shocked. He had never thought that Ji Tianxing would still have such strength after being chased for 2 hours, to be able to use such a terrifying divine ability. Even though the warship had also activated its divine cannons and released more than 300 beams of divine power. However, the second palace master was well aware that the 300-plus divine power light pillars would never be able to hurt Ji Tianxing. On the other hand, Ji Tianxing's sword strike was going to deal heavy damage to his ship. Even if the second palace master realized that something was wrong and immediately activated his divine power to release a powerful divine ability, it would still be impossible for him to block Ji Tianxing's sword strike. Firstly, he had missed the opportunity and did not have enough time. Secondly, the power of the sword strike was so terrifying that the second palace master had lost the confidence to fight it. Boom! After a quarter of an instant, the sword of apocalypse that was 10,000 feet long collided with the 300 beams of divine power, creating an earth-shattering boom. The result was undeniable. The sword of apocalypse broke through the beams of light in the sky and created a path. It then slashed the second palace master's warship with an indomitable will. Boom! In the deafening boom, the second palace master's warship's defensive light shield collapsed, and fragments of divine light splattered all over the sky. Moreover, the warship was cut in half by the giant sword. The two halves of the warship were swept away by the huge impact. Dozens of elite divine kings were flung out of the broken warship and scattered in the sky. There were also a few unlucky fellows who were struck by the sword of apocalypse and died on the spot. The extremely violent impact blew the fragments of divine light all over the sky and scattered them in all directions, sweeping across tens of thousands of miles. It was another majestic mountain range. The lush forest had been destroyed and turned into a desolate ruin. That shocking and eye-catching sword strike had successfully intimidated everyone. The thousands of elite divine kings in the warship were all stunned and did not know what to do. They could only follow the two halves of the warship and fly for tens of thousands of miles before crashing into the ruins. In the dust, a beam of green light shot up into the sky and into the clouds. Swoosh! In the dazzling green light was the figure of an elite. His robe and white hair fluttered in the wind. It was the second palace master. He was filled with shock and disbelief, but he did not look back at the warship that had been cut in half. Instead, he charged toward Ji Tianxing like a cannonball. Damn B****, how dare you destroy my warship? I'll make you wish you were dead. The second palace master roared angrily. He raised his fists and instantly threw out more than 600 fist shadows. Each of them was as big as a mountain and they all smashed toward Ji Tianxing. Cracks were torn in the sky and layers of ripples were formed. That terrifying fist radiance erupted with a power that could destroy everything. It was incomparably violent. It was obvious that the second palace master was truly enraged. He could no longer maintain his previous calmness and composure. His mid-emperor grade warship was one of his two life-bound divine artifacts. In order to build this warship, he had used up almost half of his life savings and spent hundreds of years. It was no exaggeration to say that the warship was a moving fortress. It was extremely safe. However, the second palace master did not expect that one day, his warship would be cut in half by a sword strike and be abandoned on the spot. Such a heavy loss made his heart bleed. He was burning with anger. Dragon Elephant Divine Fist. In the face of the second palace master's violent attack, Ji Tianxing did not evade at all. He also used all his strength to perform his unique skills and fought back. Bang! Bang! In the next moment, more than 600 fist shadows, which were as big as a mountain, collided with the fist radiance that was like a divine dragon and a divine elephant. There was an earth-shattering explosion. The explosion was so loud that it shook the heavens and the earth. A violent shockwave swept across 50,000 miles. In an instant, the fist radiance and the divine dragon and divine elephant shadows all collapsed and dissipated. However, the second palace master's strength was stronger. Several fist radiance as big as a mountain still hit Ji Tianxing and sent him flying. Boom! Ji Tianxing flew for more than 10,000 miles before he crashed into a broken mountain range. The mountain range was blasted into pieces and smoke and dust filled the sky. Cough, cough. He flew out of the ruins again. He used his qi to shake off the dust on his body. He coughed twice and wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth. His face was pale and his chest rose and fell violently. It was obvious that he had been injured by the second palace master. As expected of the upper state of the god emperor. Such powerful strength. Ji Tianxing used his qi to suppress his injuries as he sized up the second palace master. However, the second palace master was still angry. Looking at Ji Tianxing's unscathed appearance, he was even more shocked and furious. I already thought highly of him, but I still underestimated him. I didn't seriously injure him. Chapter 47-28. The second palace master thought that he would be able to severely injure Ji Tianxing if he used all of his power. Then it would be Ji Tianxing's turn to escape with injuries and he would chase after him. Within a few rounds he would have beaten Ji Tianxing half to death. Then he would capture him and bring him back to report to the first palace master. However, the result was completely different from what he had expected. Ji Tianxing only coughed twice and was not seriously injured. Moreover, when the second palace master took out a sword and attacked Ji Tianxing again, he still had the strength to fight back. Sky Destroyer. The second palace master roared angrily. He held the palm-sized silver sword with both hands and slashed out 9 giant swords that could split heaven and earth. Ji Tianxing was not to be outdone. He waved the sword of burial of heaven and slashed out 2 giant golden swords to fight against the second palace master. Kaboom! The sword radiance from both sides collided with a deafening sound that reverberated between heaven and earth. The violent impact left behind another stretch of ruins in the vast mountain range. Ji Tianxing could be said to be the best in the world when it came to swordsmanship attainments. However, the second palace master's strength was much higher than his. They were not at the same level at all. Therefore, Ji Tianxing was at a disadvantage in this fight. He was hit by a giant sword. The body protection divine light shattered into pieces and he flew backward. While he was still flying in the air, he spat out a mouthful of blood. His face became even paler. As his divine power became chaotic, his combat effectiveness decreased further. His spirit also became sluggish. The second palace master was naturally in high spirits. He chased after Ji Tianxing without stopping and started a fierce pursuit. He swore to take Ji Tianxing down. Ji Tianxing also knew that he could not continue to fight with the second palace master. He was no match for the second palace master. There was no way he could defeat the second palace master. A few more moves would only result in more severe injuries. Therefore, he took the opportunity of being hit by the second palace master's sword to escape into the distance. Shua. He had just flown 10,000 li away when he saw the second palace master chasing after him. He endured his injuries and forcefully used the ultimate skill so close, yet worlds apart. A white light flashed in the sky, and Ji Tianxing's figure disappeared into thin air. In the next moment he appeared 120,000 miles away, pulling away from the second palace master. He had originally thought that by temporarily distancing himself from the second palace master, he would be able to obtain temporary safety and peace. However, what he did not expect was that the second palace master had also used a similar ultimate skill. Swish. Similarly, a white light flickered as the second palace master released a powerful spatial power and instantly teleported 100,000 miles away. In the next instant he appeared behind Ji Tianxing out of thin air, a distance of 20,000 miles between them. This distance was already within the range of the second palace master's powerful attack. Ji Tianxing was shocked and very surprised. He thought to himself, I already guessed that the second palace master was hiding his true strength, but I didn't expect him to hide it so deeply. It's fine if he only knows this space diversion skill, but I'm afraid he has other trump cards. Or he can also teleport continuously in a short period of time like me. That would be troublesome. He could not defeat the second palace master in the first place. If the second palace master could teleport continuously in a short period of time like him, then he would not be able to escape even if he had wings. Just as these thoughts flashed through Ji Tianxing's mind, the second palace master raised his sword again and began to accumulate terrifying power. It could be seen that the preparation time for this ultimate skill was much longer than the previous ones. As the saying went, the longer the accumulation time, the stronger the power. One could imagine how terrifying the power of the next ultimate skill he was about to use would be. Shua, shua shua shua. After a breath, the second palace master's hands and his sword lit up with brilliant divine light. After 2 breaths, the extremely dense divine power of heaven and earth in the sky thousands of miles around him condensed into a 5-colored hurricane. Boundless energy was gathering in his body, brewing a terrifying power. The next moment the second palace master raised his sword above his head. His divine sense locked onto Ji Tianxing and he was about to use his most powerful attack. At such a critical moment, Ji Tianxing could not care about anything else. He could only grit his teeth and make a decision. So close yet worlds apart. That's right, he had no choice but to grit his teeth and use the same skill again. In the past many years he had used so close yet worlds apart many times to escape from death. He had already concluded that his divine body and godhead could only recover from the shock and impact caused by using the ultimate skill after about 15 minutes. If the cooldown time was less than 15 minutes, he would forcefully use so close, yet worlds apart, which would cause a great impact to his body and cause a certain degree of damage. This was what people called the backlash and the after effects of using the ultimate skill. Ji Tianxing understood this, but in order to escape he could only take the risk. Strike of the heavens. At the same time, the second palace master held his sword with both hands and slashed out 100-mile-long colorful giant blade made of divine light. When the giant blade made of divine light fell from the sky, endless clouds also fell from the sky, and a terrifying hurricane appeared. Such a phenomenon was very shocking, and it made the second palace master's attack seem like the wrath of the heavens. However, just as the 100-mile-long giant sword appeared, a white light flashed in the sky ahead. Ji Tianxing actually disappeared again and teleported to 120,000 miles away. Whoosh! The sudden turn of events left the second palace master dumbfounded. Damn it! How did he do that? The second palace master had mastered a similar ultimate skill. Of course, he knew how great the impact of forcefully tearing space and teleporting from a long distance would be. Even he did not dare to perform 2 consecutive teleportations in just a few breaths. This was not running for his life, it was undoubtedly self-harm. In the blink of an eye, Ji Tianxing had fled 120,000 miles away, and the strike of the heavens which could destroy the heaven and earth had missed its target. Kaboom! With an earth-shattering sound, the 100-mile-long giant sword made of divine light struck the ground. Instantly, a huge chasm that was about 100 miles wide spread across the land at an extremely fast speed, heading east and chasing after Ji Tianxing. After 3 breaths of time, the huge chasm, which was about 100 miles wide, extended for a distance of 100,000 miles before it finally stopped. The mountains and forests on both sides of the chasm were destroyed by the terrifying force and turned into ruins. The power of the strike of the heavens was terrifying. However, its effect and power were far more than that. After the 100-mile-long giant blade made such a chasm in the ground, its power was only reduced by half. It had not dissipated yet. Moreover, it still locked onto Ji Tianxing's aura and chased after Ji Tianxing relentlessly. Many God Emperor realm experts could master this ultimate skill with the effect of tracking. As long as the target was locked onto, the attack would not stop until the power completely dissipated. Chapter 47-29. At this moment Ji Tianxing's face was as pale as paper, and he was drenched in cold sweat. In just a few breaths, the second use of so close, yet worlds apart had indeed caused great damage to his divine body. Dozens of cracks had appeared on his incomparably sturdy body, which was comparable to a star. It was like a broken porcelain. Golden divine blood seeped out from the dense cracks, drenching his white robe and long hair. His face was covered in blood and his breathing was chaotic. His divine body was bent and his expression was one of pain. These were only visible injuries. What no one could see was that his meridians, which were as wide as a river and as tough as an emperor-level divine artifact, were also broken in several places. After the meridians were broken, the flow of divine power in his meridians was obstructed, and it became very obstructed. This caused his power to gradually weaken and his combat power to further decline. If he could escape from the second palace master's pursuit by paying such a terrible price, it would be worth it. At least he could return to the distorted spacetime to recuperate in seclusion, and return to his peak after 10 years. Unfortunately, he still couldn't shake off the second palace master. The 100-mile-long 5-colored light blade behind him persistently chased after him. Even though the power of the strike of the heavens had been reduced by nearly half, it was still very terrifying. With Ji Tianxing's current state, if he didn't dodge, he would still be severely injured and even lose his combat power. He would be at the mercy of the second palace master. At this critical moment, Ji Tianxing had no choice but to use another trump card. The heaven-mending pearl. Ever since he had cultivated for so many years, he had been constantly providing divine power to the heaven-mending pearl. The heaven-mending pearl would automatically absorb the spiritual energy of heaven and earth, convert it into endless power and store it in the divine pearl. If the 5 elements world was Ji Tianxing's incarnation, it represented immortality and indestructibility. Then the heaven-mending pearl was equivalent to another divinity, which helped him store endless divine power. Moreover, it was a power without any impurities and it didn't need to be converted at all. It could be used at any time. After so many years, the heaven-mending pearl had stored endless divine power, almost filling the divine pearl to the brim. Even though Ji Tianqing had encountered danger many times, he had never used the power of the heaven-mending pearl. But today the situation was too dangerous and urgent. He could not think of any other way, so he could only use this method. Limitless chaos. Ji Tianqing desperately absorbed the divine power within the heaven-mending orb and used this great protective technique to condense a huge shield. Suddenly, the heaven-mending orb was like a dam that had burst. The divine power that poured out crazily was like a torrential river. The surging divine power turned into a 10,000 zhang tall, 10 zhang thick shield that protected Ji Tianqing firmly. The moment the shield was successfully formed, the giant blade of divine light that was hundreds of miles long struck him. Boom! With an earth-shattering sound, Ji Tianqing's figure was submerged by the giant blade of divine light. Wind and clouds surged between the heavens and the earth as divine power surged. Billions of fragments of divine light burst out and sprinkled down on the ground. Ji Tianqing, who was enveloped by the divine power shield, was not killed on the spot by heaven's strike, nor was he seriously injured. But his shield was shattered and exploded into light fragments that covered the sky. He was also sent flying like a cannonball and smashed thousands of miles away. Ji Tianqing's body did not have any more wounds, but the terrifying impact was difficult to resolve. It shook him until blood came out of his mouth and nose, and his divine power was in chaos. Plop! With a muffled sound, Ji Tianqing smashed into a mountain, smashing the 1,000-zhang-tall mountain into pieces and collapsing with a loud bang. He was buried by endless rubble and dust and no longer moved. The second palace master, who was 120,000 miles away, saw Ji Tianqing being smashed into the collapsed mountain and no longer moving. He immediately showed a gratified smile. Humph! No matter how strong you are or how monstrous your talent is, you can't challenge someone of a higher level. You will be defeated by my sword in the end. The second palace master sneered complacently. He quickly held his sword and sped up. After a few breaths, when he arrived above the rubble, he released his divine sense into the rubble to search for Ji Tianqing. Where did that guy go? Why is there no movement after so long? Could he have been knocked unconscious? It had been a few breaths, but there was still no movement in the rubble. Ji Tianqing did not climb out either. The second palace master vaguely felt that something was wrong. Even if his heaven strike had severely injured Ji Tianqing, there should not be no movement at all. Unless Ji Tianqing was so weak that he was knocked unconscious. But the second palace master felt that this was unlikely. Even if Ji Tianqing had used the space diversion twice in a row, he must have suffered a backlash and been severely injured. But Ji Tianqing was the one chosen by heaven, the world's top genius. How could he be so weak? Swoosh! The second palace master's divine sense spread out like quicksilver, covering a radius of 100,000 miles. His divine sense was all-pervasive. It drilled into the rubble, searching for Ji Tianqing under the rocks and deep underground. But the result made him dumbfounded. In the rubble, mud, and debris, including the deep underground, there was no trace of Ji Tianqing. Even after the second palace master's divine sense searched a radius of 100,000 miles, he still could not find Ji Tianqing's aura. It was as if he had evaporated into thin air right under the second palace master's nose. How could this be? How did he escape? The second palace master's face darkened. His eyes were shining with a frightening cold light. He continued to fly forward to search and kill Ji Tianqing. At the same time, his divine sense quickly expanded to the maximum range, covering a radius of 330,000 miles. But the result was very shocking. Within 330,000 miles, there was no trace of Ji Tianqing. The second palace master was a little confused. His mind was full of doubts. He really couldn't understand how Ji Tianqing was able to escape without making a sound when he was already injured to such an extent. He did not see Ji Tianqing rush out of the rubble and fly into the sky. Even if Ji Tianqing still had the strength to perform the invisibility skill, the second palace master's divine sense could see through it. Moreover, in just a few breaths' time, how could Ji Tianqing escape 300,000 miles away? He could not understand. He really could not understand. At the same time, 420,000 miles in front of the second palace master, in the sky above a vast mountain range, Ji Tianxing was covered in blood, his hair was disheveled, and he was in a sorry state. He was running in the sea of clouds like a comet streaking across the sky. No one knew that when he was blasted into the collapsed mountain, he took the opportunity to use a divine ability that he hadn't used in a long time. That was heaven and earth incarnation. He could merge himself with the heaven and earth, become one with the earth within a radius of 100,000 miles, and disappear into thin air. Then he could remove this state at any time and appear anywhere within the radius of 100,000 miles. Now that he was seriously injured, he could only merge with the earth within 300,000 miles. When he removed the state of heaven and earth incarnation, he appeared in the mountain range 300,000 miles away. In addition, he was 120,000 miles away from the second palace master. So, the distance between them could be extended to 420,000 miles. Chapter 47:30. In fact, it was not only the second palace master who did not expect this result. Even Ji Tianxing did not expect that he would use this secret skill to escape from the second palace master's pursuit. Although he paid a heavy price and was severely injured, his divine power could not be sustained, and his body was covered in blood and dust, he still gritted his teeth. With the help of the boundless divine power in the heaven-patching pearl, he sped up and flew forward. Of course, he would not foolishly fly forward in a straight line. With his current speed, if he flew in a straight line and the second palace master chased in a straight line, he would soon catch up with him. By then he would not have a second chance to escape from the second palace master's hands. Therefore, after flying south for nearly 1,000,000 miles, he continued to fly east. The result was just as he expected. The second palace master completely lost track of him. In his anxiety, he sped up and flew east, maintaining a straight line. Without any evidence or clues to prove that Ji Tianxing had changed his direction, the second palace master could not change his direction rashly. He could only fly in a straight line. Although the second palace master chased east for 1,000,000 miles at his fastest speed. In order to increase his speed to the limit, he did not hesitate to use the secret skill of space diversion. However, after he chased for 1,000,000 miles, he still could not find any trace of Ji Tianxing. At this time, the second palace master finally calmed down. He stood in the sky and released his divine consciousness to search the surrounding 300,000 miles. At the same time, he muttered to himself, "That guy is severely injured. It is impossible for him to escape so quickly. Unless he predicted that I would chase him in a straight line, so he changed his direction." At the critical moment of life and death with such severe injuries, he could still remain calm and think of this detail. What a difficult guy. Thinking of this, the second palace master finally figured it out. No wonder Zhou Xian would be defeated by that guy. Even he, the second palace master, could not help but lose when he met that meticulous guy. Soon, the second palace master put away the distracting thoughts in his mind and began to use his secret skill to detect Ji Tianxing's aura within 300,000 miles. Even though his divine sense couldn't detect Ji Tianxing's whereabouts. However, he could use secret magics to detect the subtle traces and energy fluctuations Ji Tianxing had left behind when he passed by this place. Of course, the premise was that Ji Tianxing had to pass by this place and use his divine power. If Ji Tianxing didn't pass by here, then nothing would be found. Although the second palace master was extremely anxious, he had already used his fastest speed to execute his secret technique. However, even after he finished searching the area within a radius of 300,000 kilometers, he still spent 30 breaths of time without finding anything. He couldn't find any aura or traces left behind by Ji Tianxing at all. It turned out that Ji Tianxing had never passed by this place. Damn it! As expected, he changed his escape route in advance. The second palace master came to his senses and hurriedly turned around to fly back. After flying back for more than 300,000 miles, the second palace master didn't dare to waste any more time. He used his secret technique again. This time he was even more anxious and consumed more divine power. He was so tired that he was sweating profusely and his face was pale. Again, after 20 breaths of time, he used his secret technique to check the area within a radius of 300,000 kilometers. In the end, there was no change. He still couldn't find any aura left behind by Ji Tianxing. The turning point where he changed his direction isn't here. It's still ahead. The second palace master was shocked and continued to fly back. After flying for more than 300,000 kilometers, he used the same trick and used his secret technique again. This time he had finally gained something. After 20 breaths of time, he finally found the traces and aura left behind by Zhi Tianqing in the area within a radius of 300,000 kilometers. At this time his eyes had turned dark gold. The heaven and earth and space he saw in his eyes were very different from usual. He saw that in the gray heaven and earth, there was a faint line that seemed to be connected and pointed to the south. There was no doubt that the faint line was the divine power aura and fluctuations left behind by Zhi Tianqing when he flew across the sky. As time passed, the very faint line was still fading at a speed visible to the naked eye. It was estimated that in another 4 to 6 hours, the entire line would disappear completely. No matter how brilliant the second palace master's secret technique was, he couldn't detect it. I finally found him. That cunning bastard really changed his direction and escaped to the south here. Although the second palace master had consumed a lot of his divine power and was a little weak and sweating profusely, he was excited and excited. However, he was excited and excited. He was happy that he had found Zhi Tianqing's traces. However, his excitement didn't last long. A spiritual light flew from the sky and landed in front of him. He quickly picked it up and saw that it was a message from the first palace master. In the message, the first palace master said that he and the other palace masters were splitting up and rushing to the eastern border at the fastest speed. He asked the second palace master about the results of the battle and whether Zhi Tianqing had been caught. If they had already defeated and captured Zhi Tianqing, they would quickly rush over to join them. If Zhi Tianqing hadn't been caught, they would continue to surround Zhi Tianqing before entering the unknown land. The second palace master didn't dare to hesitate and quickly reported the truth to the first palace master. After sending the message, the second palace master rushed to the south without stopping to continue searching for Zhi Tianqing's trace and aura. Although he was already exhausted and his divine power was a little empty, this was the critical moment. However, this was the most critical moment. Only he could find Zhi Tianqing's escape route. If he delayed, in another 4 to 6 hours, Zhi Tianqing's trace would disappear, and he wouldn't be able to find Zhi Tianqing again. Once Zhi Tianqing successfully escaped to the unknown land, the Taiyu Shrine's operation would be at least 80% a failure. Although the first palace master had already made up his mind and given the order. Even if they had to go through the unknown land and chase to the Pantheon of Immortality's territory, they had to capture Zhi Tianqing. But if things really developed to that stage, no one wanted to see it. At that time, even if the Taiyu Shrine worked 10 times harder and paid a higher price, they might not be able to get what they wanted. At the same time, the second palace master was still gritting his teeth and using his divine powers and secret techniques to search for Zhi Tianqing's trace. Zhi Tianqing had already entered the god-slaying battleship and entered the distorted space-time of the god pagoda to recuperate in seclusion. Bai Long drove the god-slaying battleship at the fastest speed possible and rushed forward in the sky. The god-slaying battleship had been damaged, but Zhi Tianqing had kept the battleship in his body at the critical moment. Taking advantage of this opportunity, Bai Long led many God King experts to do their best to repair the battleship. Now the battleship was almost fully recovered and could be used normally. In order to make the battleship move at the fastest speed possible, Bai Long no longer activated the concealment array. He drove the god-slaying battleship at full speed to escape from the Taiyu Shrine's territory as soon as possible. Chapter 47:31. What happened next was similar to what Zhi Tianqing had expected. He had long guessed that the second palace master would pursue him at a leisurely pace just to stall him. At the same time, the other palace masters of the Taiyu Shrine would rush over from all directions and form an encirclement in advance. As such, before he could escape from the Taiyu Shrine's sphere of influence and enter the unknown lands, he would be surrounded by the other palace masters. The outcome was obvious. Therefore, he had paid a great price to shake off the second palace master. Of course, he could not proceed slowly. As an upper-level God Emperor expert, the second palace master would definitely have various means to investigate the traces and aura he left behind. Perhaps the second palace master would be able to find his escape route, but that would waste a lot of time. He wanted to use this time to escape from the Taiyu Shrine's sphere of influence as quickly as possible. The result was just as Zhi Tianqing had expected. Bai Long steered the god-slaying battleship and sped through the sky at its fastest speed. It did not encounter any obstacles for 6 hours. Even though the battleship did not hide its tracks and aura, it was like a meteor streaking across the sky. But the battleship's surroundings were deserted for hundreds of thousands of miles. At this moment, the second palace master was still behind. He was millions of miles away and was still casting spells in the sky to track him. The first palace master and the other palace masters were still in a scattered formation. They formed an encirclement that spanned hundreds of thousands of miles and quickly headed east. However, as long as there were no accidents or miracles, the Taiyu Shrine's palace masters would not be able to catch up to the god-slaying battleship. Unknowingly, another 4 hours had passed. The god-slaying battleship was unimpeded. It crossed mountains and rivers and finally left the Taiyu Shrine's territory. Hundreds of thousands of miles ahead was a dark forest and a winding mountain range. That was the unknown lands. The desolate race did not dare to set foot in it, and the Taiyu Shrine had never explored it. Ji Tianxing had previously told Bai Long about it. As long as they could enter the unknown lands, they would be half out of danger. After all, the Taiyu Shrine's hall masters and their elite army would be in danger if they entered an unknown place. The beast race, who had lived in the unknown lands for generations, did not care about your identity, origin, or purpose. As long as a foreign race dared to enter the unknown lands and was discovered by the beasts, they would be surrounded and attacked. Ji Tianxing only had one divine battleship, which made him a smaller target. It was still safe for him to travel through the unknown. However, the sect masters of the Taiyu Shrine were aggressive and imposing. Once they entered the unknown lands, they would definitely alarm the beast. At that time, the Taiyu Shrine's shrine masters would provoke the beast army and suffer some losses. It would be great if they retreated in the face of difficulties and gave up on pursuing Ji Tianxing. Of course, this was just Ji Tianxing's idea. It could also be said to be wishful thinking. He knew in his heart that this was basically impossible. The Taiyu Shrine had sent at least 5 hall masters, including the second hall master, which was enough to prove their determination. Shua. Bai Long steered the god-slaying battleship steadily into the unknown lands. According to his master's instructions, after entering the unknown lands, the battleship could not travel at full speed. They had to activate the array to hide their tracks and aura to prevent being discovered by the beast race. If necessary, they could make a short stop or take a suitable detour. In any case, the decision was in Bai Long's hands. Ji Tianxing had confidence in him. What Ji Tianxing needed to do now was to heal his injuries as quickly as possible and recover his strength as soon as possible. His previous experience had made him understand a principle. The heavenly Tao would give him a warning when his life was in danger. However, the warning had a limited time and would not last forever. In the past, he had thought that after the heavenly Tao's warning disappeared, it meant that his crisis was over. However, this experience made him understand that this was not the case. Even if the heavenly Tao's warning disappeared, he could not let his guard down. Even if the god-slaying battleship could escape into the unknown lands, he still had to be careful. Only when he recovered from his injuries and strength, or when he personally steered the battleship or left the unknown lands, would he be truly safe. When they first entered the unknown lands, Bai Long was still careful and vigilant. He constantly monitored his surroundings. However, in the periphery of the unknown lands, desolate race gods would often appear, as well as some bold adventurers. Those beast race that had gained sentience would not be foolish enough to wander around the region blindly. They would be treated as prey by the adventurers, or become training targets for the desolate race gods. Bai Long steered the battleship for half a day without any mishaps. After traveling tens of millions of miles, the god-slaying battleship gradually left the periphery and entered an even more eerie and ancient region. At this point, there were more signs of beast activity in the surrounding mountains and forests. As for the desolate race gods and adventurers, they did not dare venture any deeper. This was already within the beast race's sphere of influence. The god-slaying battleship's situation would only become more and more dangerous. Indeed. 2 hours later, as the god-slaying battleship advanced, it alarmed a group of godly monarch realm beast race. There were more than 30 beast race members. They had different appearances and species, but they all looked ferocious. Their bodies were shrouded in a murderous aura. They were leading hundreds of divine lord realm beast race members. They were gathered together as though they were having a meeting and discussing something. The beast race was also divided into different clans. There would also be friction between them, especially when it came to territorial disputes. However, as they were having an intense discussion, they suddenly sensed a strange divine power fluctuation that flew over their heads. Immediately, a few of the stronger beast race leaders stopped their discussion and looked up at the sky. Although the god-slaying battleship was in an invisible state, they did not see anything. However, the leaders of the beast race were all gifted or possessed special racial talents, so they could still sense that something was wrong. It seems like something flew over? Perhaps. I also feel that something is amiss. But there's nothing in the sky. With my racial talents, I don't think it's wrong. There's just a fluctuation of energy. A few of the beast race leaders who sensed something amiss began whispering to each other. As for the other beast race leaders, they also stopped talking and glared angrily at them as they raised their doubts. Hey, what are you guys doing? We're talking about serious matters. What are you guys doing? Are you playing dumb with us? There's clearly nothing in the sky. Your acting skills are really bad. Alright, stop pretending. Let's get down to business. Let's discuss how we're going to split the wind slope ridge. Being questioned by the beast race leaders, the beast race leaders' unwillingness to lose was aroused. They were originally wavering, but their attitudes and positions became firm. What do you guys know? We all sensed it. There's a problem. Yes. I'll send a message to the leaders right now and report the abnormality to them. Chapter 4732. The beast race leaders sensed an abnormal aura, but they did not see anything. After discussing for a while, they made up their minds. Two of the beast race leaders hurriedly sent messages to the other overlords, reporting the abnormal situation they had discovered. There were a total of 3 overlords in this unknown land, all of whom were God Emperor realm ancient beasts. They had divided this unknown land into 3 regions, each of which ruled over. Even though the 3 overlords ruled separately, they were still allies, advancing and retreating together. Because they deeply understood that internal strife could not be allowed. They had to work together to ensure the prosperity of the beast race and resist the invasion of the 2 god temples. If they fought with each other to seize territory and citizens, it would give the 2 god temples an opportunity to take advantage of, and they would all be eliminated in the end. Therefore, the beasts of the unknown lands all approved of the 3 overlords. They would not defy the other 2 overlords just because they were in their own territory. Whoosh. Whoosh whoosh whoosh. In the blink of an eye, the beast race leaders flew into the sky and chased after the god-slaying battleship. Even though they did not know what they were chasing or whether they would be able to find anything, this was their instinct. If they did not chase after it to see what was going on, they would not be at ease. When the other 30 beast race leaders saw them fly away, they thought that they were running away from the problem, so they cursed and chased after them. Hey you bastards, what are you trying to do? Even if you can escape today, can you escape tomorrow? The problem is destined to be solved. Running away is useless. Today I want to see what tricks you can play. Wherever you run, we will follow. Numerous beast race leaders shouted and chased after them. A group of God King powerhouses majestically flew through the sky. As divine light flashed, it caused an enormous commotion. On the other side, the 3 God Emperor realm overlords received messages one after another. When they learned that an abnormal fluctuation of divine power had appeared in the territory of a certain overlord, they did not see anything. 2 of the lords thought about it for a while, but they didn't think much of it and didn't take it to heart. In their opinion, the unknown land was simply too vast. It was reasonable for such groundless rumors to occur occasionally, so there was no need to feel nervous. After all, in the past 10,000 years, neither the Taiyu Shrine nor the Pantheon of Immortality had shown much hostility, nor did they intend to invade or occupy the unknown land. Therefore, it was impossible for this to be an attack from the 2 temples. There was no need to pay attention to it. However, the 3rd overlord Qian Kuan was different from the other 2 overlords. This unknown land was divided into 3 regions. East, North and South by the 3 lords. The eastern region where the incident occurred was the Heaven and Earth Lord's sphere of influence. Coincidentally, the Heaven and Earth Overlord's cave abode was 100 million miles to the east. At first, it was a little hesitant about whether or not it was necessary to take a look at such a trivial matter. However, it soon received messages from the other two lords, saying that such a small matter was not worth their time and that the Qinquan lord should deal with it himself. Since the other two lords had said so, the Heaven and Earth Lord could only lead a group of elite godly king experts to the scene of the incident to investigate. No matter what the truth was, no matter if it was a misunderstanding or not, it had to be thoroughly investigated to be able to account for it. High in the sky, the god-slaying battleship was still advancing at lightning speed. Bai Long was still muttering to himself as he steered the battleship. When I passed by that mountain range earlier, there seemed to be a group of beasts in the forest below. I was flying a little low. I wonder if they noticed the god-slaying battleship passing by? If they did, they would definitely chase after us to investigate, right? As this thought flashed through his mind, Bai Long steered the god-slaying battleship while releasing his divine perception to look back. The result was without a doubt. Within 100,000 miles of his divine perception, there was no trace of any beast experts. It was impossible for those godly king realm beasts to catch up to the god-slaying battleship. Since that was the case, Bai Long did not take it to heart. After all, the god-slaying battleship would definitely encounter many wild beasts and beasts as it passed through the unknown land. Not only had they encountered a few before, but they would also encounter many more in the future. Therefore, Bai Long did not care about this matter and continued to steer the god-slaying battleship forward. Time passed quietly. Unknowingly, 4 hours had passed. The god-slaying battleship had flown tens of millions of miles to the east. During this time, the god-slaying battleship had passed by dozens of mountain ranges and forests. It did not matter whether those beasts had discovered the god-slaying battleship or not. At the very least, no one could catch up to the god-slaying battleship. Bai Long silently calculated the time and distance. He estimated that they would be able to leave the unknown land in a few days. But at this moment something unexpected happened. In the sky ahead, a dazzling divine light lit up. It was as if dark clouds had covered the sky. That divine light was approaching them at an extremely fast speed. It carried with it a surging aura and an unstoppable aura. Bai Long was shocked. As he steered the god-slaying battleship to avoid that surging divine light, he thought to himself, what's going on? I was clearly very careful and had been using my divine perception to scan the surrounding tens of thousands of miles. Why did that divine light suddenly appear and I did not detect it in advance? Looking at the momentum of that divine light, there must be many experts. Why was it that I could only see them when they were 40,000 miles away from the battleship? Could it be that divine light was the work of a god emperor expert? That must be it. Only a god emperor expert would have the strength and means to avoid the detection of me and the god-slaying battleship. As Ji Tianxing's proud disciple, Bai Long naturally had the ability to speculate and analyze. His heart suddenly tightened. He became even more cautious. He did his best to conceal the god-slaying battleship's tracks and aura. Although he did not know why a god emperor expert had suddenly appeared here, leading so many god-king realm beasts, and why the other party was so aggressive, he did not know. For the time being, he could only treat it as a coincidence that he had encountered them. No matter what, he had to be even more careful and avoid the other party. He could not be exposed. But things did not go as he wished. The more he feared something, the more it came. When the god-slaying battleship changed direction and headed north, that dazzling divine light also changed direction and moved tens of thousands of miles to the north. Moreover, that divine light sped up and headed straight for the god-slaying battleship. Seeing this, Bai Long's expression changed. His heart was in his throat. It's over. The god emperor expert in that divine light has discovered our battleship. Their target is us. At this moment, Bai Long was extremely nervous. He no longer dared to hesitate. He directly raised the battleship's speed to the limit and accelerated into the distance. Chapter 47:33. In order to escape as quickly as possible, they had to shake off the god emperor in the divine light. White Dragon could no longer be bothered with concealing the god-slaying battleship's tracks and aura. Since they had been exposed, they might as well escape with all their might. The outcome was obvious. As the god-slaying battleship accelerated, it emitted an intense divine power fluctuation. Its target became clearer. The divine light also accelerated. Like a divine light blade, it chased after the god-slaying battleship to the north. Swish! The divine light flashed as it emitted an even more intense divine power fluctuation. It alarmed all the beasts in the surrounding 50,000 kilometers. The god-slaying battleship removed the array that concealed its tracks and aura. It reached its fastest speed, but it was completely exposed to the enemy. Inside the divine light was the God Emperor's middle realm, Heaven Lord, leading 500 elite high-ranking godly monarchs. Upon seeing the god-slaying battleship, the hundreds of godly monarchs were energized. Heaven Lord was also surprised as he revealed a look of disbelief. Indeed, there's a situation. Those rascals didn't lie to me. I never expected that the desolate race's battleship would come here. I want to see what you are up to. Heaven Lord's first reaction was that the Taiyu Shrine, which was the closest, had sent the God Emperor's experts and battleship to invade an unknown land. Therefore he had to catch up to the god-slaying battleship no matter what. He had to capture the person inside and interrogate him. Unfortunately, the battleship was an Emperor-level divine artifact. When it fled at full speed, its speed was unbelievably fast. Heaven Lord led 500 elite godly monarchs. No matter how fast they flew, they could not catch up to the battleship. Seeing the distance between the two sides gradually widen, Heaven Lord turned anxious. I'll chase after the god-slaying battleship first. All of you follow behind. Also, send the order to the surrounding leaders to surround and intercept it. Heaven Lord separated himself from the elite beasts and accelerated in pursuit of the god-slaying battleship. Although he was agitated, he was able to maintain his calm. He calmly and decisively gave the order. He was confident in his own strength, but he was not blindly arrogant to think that he could deal with the god-slaying battleship alone. As a precaution, he sent the order to get the other leaders to help. This would give him a greater chance of intercepting the god-slaying battleship. Of course, if the situation worsened and he and his elite godly kings were unable to deal with the divine warship, he would seek help from the other two lords. In any case, they had always been allies. In the face of an invasion, of course, they had to work together. A few breaths later, the Heaven and Earth Lord chased after the god-slaying battleship and disappeared into the horizon. The 500 beastmen elites continued to advance, but a few captains were responsible for transmitting messages to the surrounding beastmen leaders. White Dragon steered the god-slaying battleship and fled frantically. But in the process of fleeing, his emotions gradually calmed down. Even though his spiritual awareness had detected a huge figure chasing after the battleship for tens of thousands of miles, he still couldn't let it go. However, his thumping heart gradually calmed down, and he calmly made a series of reactions. First, he removed the concealment array of the battleship and focused all his energy on flight and escape. Secondly, he activated the defensive shield of the battleship, in case the God Emperor of the beast race were to attack them from behind. After that, he hurriedly contacted Zhou Xian, who was recuperating in seclusion in the divine pagoda, and reported the situation to his master. Less than a day had passed in the outside world. Zhou Xian never expected that he would be awakened by White Dragon after entering the distorted spacetime and cultivating in seclusion for 20-odd days. There was no need to ask. White Dragon must have woken him up so early. Something must have happened. Swoosh. Zhou Xian hurriedly ended his recuperation and left the distorted spacetime, appearing in the cockpit of the god-slaying battleship. At the critical moment, White Dragon was busy controlling the god-slaying battleship, so he did not bow to Zhou Xian. This was something Zhou Xian tacitly agreed to. He did not waste any time and directly told the truth. Master, we encountered a group of beastmen. The leader seems to be a god emperor. He's chasing after us. Zhou Xian could guess what was going on. There was no need to ask White Dragon. He knew that the god-slaying battleship had leaked its whereabouts and aura during its journey, and the beastmen had sensed it. Previously, when he entered the divine pagoda to recuperate and handed control of the battleship to White Dragon, he had expected this risk. However, now that it had happened, it was too late to say anything. The most important thing now was to find out the identity and purpose of the God Emperor behind the battleship, as well as what level of strength he was at. Zhou Xian did not hesitate to release his divine sense and spread it out in all directions to investigate the specific situation. Indeed, with the god-slaying battleship as the center, there was only one aura within a radius of 200,000 miles. It was a beast that was 200 feet long and had a wingspan of nearly 300 feet. Its appearance was like a giant bird, but it had the head of a deer and 2 pairs of broad wings. Its entire body was dark red like fire and it was very aggressive. According to Ji Tianxing's experience, this should be the legendary Fei Lian. However, the appearance of this Fei Lian was slightly different from the legendary Fei Lian. Of course, this was understandable. After all, this was the planet of origin. Everything Ji Tianxing had seen and heard before came from the deity realm, the dragon realm, and the lower realm. Perhaps the Fei Lian in the eyes of the world was only the descendant of this Fei Lian. The appearance of this beast race god emperor wasn't important. What Ji Tianxing was most concerned about was its level of strength. The middle level of the god emperor seemed to have condensed 5 or 6 Taoist rhymes. This was because when the heaven and earth overlord was chasing after the god-slaying battleship, there were 5 complicated Taoist rhymes in the divine power that formed halos. However, Ji Tianxing could not be sure if the other party had used all his strength. Therefore, he could only make a preliminary judgment that this god emperor's strength was at least 5 Taoist rhymes. I didn't expect the overlord of this unknown land to be so strong. Any one of them has at least 5 Taoist rhymes. If it were any other time, I wouldn't be afraid of it and could easily defeat it. But now, I've only been in seclusion for 20 days. My injuries have only stabilized, but I haven't fully recovered. With my current state and combat strength, I'm almost no match for it. I can't fight it head-on. I have to think of a way. Ji Tianxing was not in a hurry to make a move. He used his divine sense to observe the heaven and earth overlord. At the same time, he calculated silently. The white dragon said that he encountered a group of beast race experts. This means that the Fei Lian came prepared. It brought at least a few hundred beast race elites. It's just that those God King beast race elites can't catch up to the god-slaying battleship, so the Fei Lian acted alone. If I attack the Fei Lian, I have to end it quickly. I can't get entangled with it. If the other party delays and the beast race reinforcements arrive, it will be difficult for us to escape. Chapter 47-34. Ji Tianxing was well aware of the current situation. Before Heaven and Earth Lord understood the situation or knew how many people were on the battleship, he had already thought of a follow-up plan. Since he had a clear goal and plan, he could not waste any time. Ji Tianxing decisively ordered White Dragon to be in charge of fleeing and dodging while he controlled the battleship's divine cannons and defenses. White Dragon naturally obeyed and focused on controlling the battleship, constantly paying attention to the surrounding situation. Ji Tianxing locked onto Heaven and Earth Lord's aura and quickly activated the divine cannons. Immediately, more than 360 divine cannons lit up with divine light, accumulating terrifying power. An invisible pressure locked onto Heaven and Earth Lord 40,000 miles behind the battleship, greatly increasing the pressure on him and causing him to feel cold all over. When Heaven and Earth Lord saw the rows of cannons, he immediately understood what was going on. His expression also changed, his pupils constricting as a cold glint flashed in his eyes. Taking advantage of the time the divine cannons were accumulating power, he also accumulated divine power and was ready to attack. In the next moment, a deafening sound was heard. Boom! More than 300 divine cannons simultaneously spewed out multicolored divine power pillars, carrying with them the power to destroy heaven and earth as they ruthlessly bombarded Heaven and Earth Lord. At this moment, tens of thousands of miles of heaven and earth were illuminated by a blinding light. Even though Heaven and Earth Lord had the strength of a god emperor, he would be smashed to pieces if he was hit by the 300 divine power pillars. However, he was already prepared. The moment the divine power pillars appeared, he had already unleashed his divine power and moved nearly 5,000 miles to the left. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. The divine power pillars were too fast. In just a quarter of an instant, they had swallowed up the area where Heaven and Earth Lord was. Although he had escaped in time, dodging most of the divine power pillars, more than 30 divine power pillars still hit him. However, there were still more than 30 divine light pillars that struck it. Along with its divine shield, the divine light shattered and filled the sky with fragments of divine light. Heaven and Earth Lord was also sent flying by the huge impact, deviating from his original path and landing unsteadily in the sky not far away. He had personally experienced the power of the Emperor-level battleship and knew that it was not to be trifled with, so he braced himself and went all out to deal with it. Filled with anger, He reformed his divine power shield and flapped his 2 pairs of wide wings as he sped towards the god-slaying battleship. He opened his mouth and spewed out scarlet flames that blotted out the sun. They poured down on the god-slaying battleship like a flood. The raging flames burned the sky and several spatial cracks appeared in the sky. Layers of spatial ripples appeared. If the god-slaying battleship was engulfed by the flames, it would be very dangerous. However, Ji Tianxing was prepared for this and he had already launched a second wave of attacks. He once again controlled god-slaying battleships, divine power god-slaying battleships, divine power. The god-slaying battleships in the sky was god-slaying battleships, divine power god-slaying battleship. Boom. A slaying battleship. The loud bang bang bang, slaying battleship. The flames melted the countless beams of divine power, causing them to quickly dissipate. However, the numerous pillars of divine power also destroyed the divine flames that filled the sky, causing them to turn into millions of sparks that scattered down from the sky. Both attacks were extremely powerful, but they did not achieve the desired results. They cancelled each other out in the sky. When the Qianquan Lord saw that his attack had been so easily neutralized, he flew into a rage. Damn desolate race bastards, so what if you have a battleship? I don't believe that you won't consume resources when you launch an attack with a warship. Can your attack speed be faster than mine? Indeed, only the various divine temples of the desolate race had emperor-class battleships. As for the beast race, they had no way to create a divine warship. They couldn't even create an imperial divine warship. In the past tens of thousands of years, the beast race and the experts of the 2 temples had fought and killed each other many times. What gave the beast race experts the most headaches were the battleships of the 2 temples. As long as they had enough resources and their warships weren't damaged or destroyed, they could continue to attack and bring great trouble to the beast race experts. However, although a battleship was a killing machine on the battlefield, it was not omnipotent. The most basic point was that a battleship needed a certain amount of time to launch an attack. It could take as long as a few seconds or even 10 or 20 seconds. The shortest would be a few seconds. This was the experience that the beast race experts had accumulated over tens of thousands of years of fighting the desolate race experts. For example, the Qianquan Lord knew the weakness of the battleship, so he had grasped the technique to deal with the battleship. As the divine flames and divine power pillars of light collapsed and dissipated, the Qianquan Lord had already begun his next move. At his fastest speed, he circled around to the side of the god-slaying battleship. He raised his deer-like head and released hundreds of lightning pillars and dark red flame pillars that blasted at the battleship. The battleship was massive in size. Although it could fly very quickly, it was not agile enough to maneuver around in a small space. Even if Ji Tianxing personally piloted the god-slaying battleship, he was unable to overcome this inherent flaw. It was impossible for the battleship to turn around or change the direction of the divine cannons before accumulating energy to attack the Qianquan Lord. At this critical moment, Ji Tianxing could only temporarily give up on piloting the battleship. He released what little divine power he had left to condense a gigantic shield to block the Qianquan Lord's attack. Boom! Hundreds of lightning pillars and dark red flame pillars slammed into the gigantic shield, producing an earth-shattering boom that reverberated throughout the world. Ji Tianxing had yet to recover from his injuries and he was still very weak. After forming the divine power shield, it was very difficult for him to launch a counterattack against the Qianquan Lord within a second. As such, all he could do was block the Qianquan Lord's attack and protect the god-slaying battleship from being damaged. However, he had already prepared a plan. As he formed the shield, he sent a voice transmission to another god emperor. Pan Ruo, it's your turn. That's right. The trump card he had prepared in advance was Pan Ruo, God Emperor. Although Pan Ruo, God Emperor had been injured previously, she had recuperated in the distorted spacetime for so long that her injuries were more than half healed. Ji Tianxing had just told her his plan and she had agreed without hesitation. Furthermore, she had prepared herself. In fact, she already had a certain level of tacit understanding with Ji Tianxing. There was no need for Ji Tianxing to send her a voice transmission. The moment Ji Tianxing released his divine power and formed the shield, she had already charged out of the battleship and attacked the Qianquan Lord from the side. Swish, swish, swish. She went all out, brandishing her sword and sending out more than 30 sword flashes. Using the sharpest and fiercest stance, she launched a surprise attack on the Qianquan Lord. Although the Qianquan Lord had been very careful and cautious in his actions, he had been wary of the god-slaying battleship. However, he had never expected that there would be two God Emperor experts hidden in the battleship. One of the God Emperor had formed the shield while the other God Emperor had launched a sneak attack on him. Chapter 47-35. No matter how powerful a God Emperor expert was, if he wasn't prepared and was caught off guard, he would be at a disadvantage if he was ambushed at close range. Moreover, the Heaven and Earth Overlord was not very strong. At the very least, he had not reached the upper realm of God Emperor. The difference in strength between him and the Prajna God Emperor was only 1 or 2 Dao rhymes. Boom! With a dull explosion, more than 30 dazzling sword flashes struck the Heaven and Earth Overlord, sending him flying. Its divine light shield was shattered, and more than a dozen bloody wounds were left on its body, spurting out more than a dozen blood flowers. In pain, the Heaven and Earth Overlord let out a furious roar and retreated 20,000 miles away from the god worship. He neutralized the impact of the sword flashes and hurriedly circulated his energy to suppress his injuries and expel the remaining sword chi in his body. Using this opportunity, the Prajna God Emperor returned to the god-slaying battleship, and the battleship accelerated forward. This was naturally one of Zhou Xian's plans. He had no intention of killing the Heaven and Earth Overlord or severely injuring him. He only wanted to teach him a lesson so that he would retreat. Or perhaps, after lightly injuring him, he could use the battleship to escape while the Heaven and Earth Overlord was treating his injuries and shake him off. Reality proved that Zhou Xian's plan was not a problem, and it was successfully implemented. In a few short breaths, the Heaven and Earth Overlord treated his injuries and circulated his energy to expel the remaining sword chi in his body. But by this time, the god-slaying battleship had already flown tens of thousands of miles away. Damn it! The Heaven and Earth Overlord cursed angrily and hurriedly increased his speed. As a divine beast, Feiyan's flying speed was unquestionable. Of course, it could surpass other divine beasts of the same realm. However, the distance between it and the god-slaying battleship had increased to 80,000 miles. It would be difficult to catch up in a short period of time. Both parties engaged in a chase high in the sky, neither concealing their tracks or auras. They flew as fast as lightning, shining with dazzling divine light and leaving a long trail of flames behind them. As time passed, the distance between the two parties narrowed bit by bit. As for the 500 elite god kings that the Heaven and Earth Overlord had brought with him, they loyally carried out their orders and chased after the god-slaying battleship. However, due to their weak strength, they were unable to catch up to the Heaven and Earth Overlord. Instead, the distance between them widened. However, with the Qianquan Overlord's orders, even if they knew they couldn't catch up, they couldn't give up. Unknowingly, half an hour passed. He watched as the Heaven and Earth Lord exhausted all his strength and finally caught up to the god-slaying warship. When the distance between the two sides was 20,000 miles, it began to accumulate divine power, preparing to launch an attack. But at this moment, Zhou Xian suddenly appeared. It was still the same old method as before. He suddenly put away the god-slaying battleship and used the so close, yet so far divine ability. Thus, with a flash of white light, Zhou Xian disappeared from the sky and reappeared hundreds of thousands of miles away. Then he took out the god-slaying battleship and returned to the god-slaying battleship. It was still White Dragon driving the battleship, moving forward quickly and steadily. Heaven and Earth Lord was dumbfounded. He could not believe that the other party had escaped right under his nose. While it was stunned, it could only withdraw the divine power it had accumulated and continue chasing after the deity-slaying battleship. This time, the distance between the two sides had increased by hundreds of thousands of miles. If it wanted to catch up to the deity-slaying battleship again, it would take even longer. Encountering such a difficult opponent, the Heaven and Earth Lord's unyielding nature was aroused. Anger surged in its heart. No matter which deity hall the other party was from, since they had sent a battleship and 2 God Emperor experts into the unknown, they definitely couldn't be allowed to leave alive. But with its strength alone, it wasn't enough to intercept and kill the other party. Thus, as it chased after the deity-slaying battleship, it sent a message to the other 2 overlords, requesting their assistance as soon as possible. Of course, this would work. This was because if the deity-slaying battleship fled east, it would pass through the territory of one of the overlords. As for the other overlord, it would have enough time to rush over to the deity-slaying battleship's route. 4 hours later, the group chasing after the deity-slaying battleship grew larger and larger. At the front of this group was naturally the deity-slaying battleship. Following closely behind, the Heaven and Earth Lord chased relentlessly in the sky hundreds of thousands of miles away. Further behind, there were more than 10 beast race leaders leading a large group of beast race godly monarchs 5 million miles away. They were also desperately chasing after the deity-slaying battleship. Continuing to look behind the group, there were 500 beast race elites under the Heaven and Earth Lord who were 15 million miles away in the sky. They were also burying their heads in their journey. And at the back of the group, about 50 million miles away from the deity-slaying battleship, there were 7 beast race leaders. They were also rushing eastward as fast as lightning. At the same time, the second Palace Master, first Palace Master, and fifth Palace Master had already finished gathering. The 3 deity-slaying battleships were also flying at full speed, tearing through the sky as they rushed eastward in a grandiose manner. The 3 Palace Masters were the first to gather. Without hesitation they chased into the unknown. As for the 3rd Palace Master, 4th Palace Master and 6th Palace Master, they had also gathered at the borders of the unknown. Currently they had also entered the unknown. However, it was absolutely impossible for them to catch up to Xianxia. With the 1st Palace Master in the lead, the 3 deity-slaying battleships formed a majestic fleet that sped through the unknown. Along the way, countless beast race leaders and experts were alarmed. They all sent voice transmissions to the 3 beast race lords to report that the Taiyu Shrine's fleet had arrived and was launching a large-scale attack on the unknown. Although there were some beast race leaders who were bolder or whose blood had been stimulated, they dared to intercept and chase after the 1st Palace Master's fleet. However, these were all futile. They were too slow and were quickly shaken off by the fleet. Even if there were some divine abilities that barely managed to touch the 3 Palace Masters' battleships, they were easily neutralized and repelled. Just like that, the 1st Palace Master's fleet advanced triumphantly as if it was unstoppable. Another 2 hours later, the 1st Palace Master's fleet discovered something. In the sky ahead there were 7 godly King Realm beast race leaders. They were rushing as fast as lightning. Looking at their murderous postures, it did not seem like they were rushing over. Instead, it seemed like they were going to capture or kill someone. The 1st Palace Master decisively ordered the 2nd Palace Master and 5th Palace Master to kill a few beast race leaders and capture a few alive. After extorting confessions through torture or soul interrogation, the 1st Palace Master and the others figured out the reason. Just as they had guessed, a foreign tribe's deity-slaying battleship had entered the unknown and was fleeing toward the east. They were only following orders to intercept and provide support. There was no need for further questioning. The 1st Palace Master and the others immediately understood that the foreign tribe's deity-slaying battleship must be their target. Therefore, the 1st Palace Master killed the beast race leaders and threw their corpses into the wilderness. The fleet sped up and chased toward the east with murderous intent. After another few hours, the 1st Palace Master's fleet encountered another situation. In the sky ahead, there were 500 godly King Realm beast race experts who were also rushing forward with all their might. The result was self-evident. Chapter 47-36. The 1st Palace Master, 2nd Palace Master, and 5th Palace Master all took action. With their strength they easily killed more than half of the beast race experts. The remaining half of the beast race experts were captured and locked in the various divine warships. As the fleet continued to head east, the soldiers under the Hall Masters began to interrogate the beast race god kings. Most of the god kings of the beast race had managed to endure the torture, and there were even a few who had strong personalities who chose to commit suicide. However, a small number of beast race god kings still confessed. The 1st Palace Master used a soul assimilation technique to seize the memories of a few beast race god kings. As a result, the 3 Palace Masters understood that these elite beast race god kings were under the command of the Heaven and Earth Overlord and were pursuing a divine worship of a foreign race. Other than Heaven and Earth Lord, who was following closely behind the battleship, many beast leaders also rushed over from all directions to intercept and stop the divine battleship. This result was basically the same as the information they obtained from interrogating the beast race leaders. It also allowed the 3 palace masters to confirm that they were not going in the wrong direction. After confirming the outcome and the route, the first hall master gave the order for the 2 hall masters and the soldiers to kill all of the beast race's elite god kings. In any case, these beast race god kings had already lost their value. Killing them was as easy as squashing a few ants. After throwing the corpses of the beast race god kings into the forest, the fleet accelerated and headed east. Just like that, with the addition of a third force, the pursuit team became even more complicated. The heaven and earth overlord pursued the divine slaying warship relentlessly. At the same time, he sent a message to the other 2 overlords to inform them of the route and direction, urging them to hurry over. 10 million miles behind him, more than a dozen beast race leaders and a large group of beast race god kings were chasing with all their might. Another 10 million miles behind them was the fleet led by the first palace master. They were also rushing east at lightning speed. As time passed, this complicated pursuit team gradually passed through the heaven and earth overlord's territory and approached the next overlord's territory. At the same time, the other 2 overlords were also rushing at full speed towards the predetermined area. Based on the speed of the various parties, the fleet led by the first palace master would be able to catch up to the divine slaying warship in about 2 days. After a few more hours, the other 2 lords of the unknown lands would arrive at the designated area and encounter the god-slaying battleship and the first hallmaster's fleet. The various forces were destined to gather together and put on a complicated, chaotic, and exciting show. The situation continued to develop without any unforeseen changes. Heaven and Earth Lord had been doing his best to chase after the god-slaying battleship, but to no avail. Every time it was about to catch up to the god-slaying battleship, Xianxia, who had been recuperating in the distorted spacetime inside the 9 Heavens 10 Absolutes pagoda, would appear and use so close, yet worlds apart to escape hundreds of thousands of miles away. After that, Heaven and Earth Lord had to spend a long time before he could catch up to the god-slaying battleship. When it got close to the god-slaying battleship, the same scene would play out again. Xianxia would appear again and use his ultimate skill to increase the distance between them. The first few times Heaven and Earth Lord was shocked and incredulous. Later on, after so many times, Heaven and Earth Overlord became numb from the shock and his emotions calmed down. He only felt that the white-robed alien youth was unfathomable. The ability to teleport hundreds of thousands of miles away was extremely shocking. It had to be a trump card. Such an ultimate skill could not be used consecutively within a short period of time. Otherwise, it would cause great damage to one's body. However, that alien youth was clearly talented. He could use it once every 4 to 6 hours. Most importantly, every time the alien youth appeared, he did not seem to suffer any backlash or injury. Instead, his condition became better and better, and his essence, energy, and spirit became more and more abundant. This was just too strange. Heaven and Earth Lord could not understand what was going on. He could only be more vigilant and alert. In the sky more than 10 million miles behind them. After 18 hours, the first Hallmaster's fleet finally caught up to the dozen or so beast race leaders and a large group of beast race god kings. Although the Hallmasters had already guessed the reason why the beast race leaders and god kings were in such a hurry with their previous experience, they still attacked the beast race leaders and god kings. However, when they caught up with the god kings of the beast race, they launched an attack and killed more than half of the god kings in an instant. The small number of survivors were captured by the Hallmasters and subjected to another round of torture and soul interrogation. The final result was as they had expected. The beast race leaders and god kings were indeed following Heaven and Earth Lord's orders to surround and kill the alien battleship. This proved that the first Hallmaster's fleet had not chased in the wrong direction. Furthermore, they were getting closer and closer to the god-slaying battleship. The soldiers were invigorated as they worked even harder to control the battleship and accelerate forward. It had been 2 days since Heaven and Earth Lord discovered the god-slaying battleship and began his pursuit. In these 2 days he had caught up to the god-slaying battleship 9 times, but he was shaken off each time. As a result, he had expended a large amount of divine power and was mentally exhausted. However, he did not have the chance to attack because he was in a hurry. He was filled with rage, but he could not do anything to the god-slaying battleship. He sent a message to the 2 lords to ask when they would arrive to help. The two lords quickly replied, telling him not to worry and that they would arrive soon. Heaven and Earth Lord secretly heaved a sigh of relief. He thought to himself that when the two lords arrived, they would ambush and intercept the god-slaying battleship. Everything would be perfect. At that time, no matter how many tricks the other party had, they would not be able to escape from their palms. However, Heaven and Earth Lord never expected that just as he was rubbing his palms and preparing for a big battle, something unexpected would happen. In the sky behind him, a dazzling divine light was gradually approaching. Just by looking at it, one could only see a dazzling divine light. However, Heaven and Earth Lord released his divine perception and saw the scene in the divine light. When he saw the three god-slaying battleships in the divine light, he could not help but tremble. His expression turned ferocious as his eyes darkened. Damn alien bastards. They actually have accomplices? For battleships invading our territory. What are they trying to do? Without hesitation, Qianquan Lord mixed the three warships behind him with the warship in front of him. Furthermore, he used his divine perception to see the insignia on the three battleships. He immediately recognized them as the flagship of the Taiyu Shrine's Hall Master. Based on his previous experience with the Taiyu Shrine, he knew that since the Taiyu Shrine's Hall Masters were here, there must be a large number of elite soldiers on the battleships. Looking at the other party's posture, they were most likely invading the unknown territory to seize this territory. Chapter 4737. For tens of thousands of years, the temple masters of the Taiyu Shrine and the Pantheon of Immortality had ventured into the unknown lands many times. The two temples had indeed thought of conquering the unknown lands, but they had never succeeded. The environment of the unknown lands was harsh and there were dangers everywhere. There were also endless beasts. Even if the temple masters of the two temples led thousands or tens of thousands of elite godly kings, they could only return in defeat under the siege of hundreds of thousands or millions of beasts. As time passed and the number of failures increased, the two temples would weigh the pros and cons. They felt that it was not worth it to lose elite troops for no reason. For nearly 10,000 years, the two temples had never launched a large-scale attack. Normally, there were only a few adventurers and scattered godly king experts that entered the unknown lands to train and explore. Even though the three factions had maintained peace for nearly 10,000 years, the beasts were always vigilant and guarded against the two temples. Now that the Taiyu Shrine's battleship had appeared, how could Heaven and Earth Lord not misunderstand? While he was anxious, he hurriedly sent a message to the other two lords, telling them that the Taiyu Shrine's army had invaded and that they should immediately send an elite army to support them. After sending the message, the Heaven and Earth Lord gave another order for the beast race leaders nearby to bring reinforcements over as soon as possible. That damn Taiyu Shrine. After being silent for nearly 10,000 years, they actually made a comeback. They really don't give up on their evil intentions. This time, blood will flow into rivers and corpses will be everywhere. Although Heaven and Earth Lord said words of pity and lamented the countless beasts that were about to die in battle, the beasts of the beasts were naturally innate. However, it was in the beast's nature to be warlike. Its blood was still boiling and it was looking forward to it. Swoosh, swoosh. The fleet led by the Temple Master's flagship had naturally discovered Heaven and Earth Lord. Apart from the Temple Master who had never personally led an expedition and had never seen Heaven and Earth Lord before, the other two Temple Masters recognized him. They hurriedly reported to the Temple Master about Heaven and Earth Lord's identity and related information. The Grand Palace Master was very confident and gave the order in an imposing manner. Don't bother about that ugly snake. Our target is that strange race youth. Heaven and Earth Lord has been chasing after that alien youth. Since we have caught up to him, it means that the alien youth is not far ahead. He ignored the Heaven and Earth Overlord and sped up to find that foreign race youth as soon as possible. If the Qianquan Overlord dares to spoil our plans, then we'll kill him as well. The Lord Hallmaster's words were very domineering, but he was an upper realm god emperor, so he had the right to be domineering. Thus, the three warships spared no expense and increased their speed to the maximum. The speed of the entire fleet increased by about 10% and the effect was very obvious. Heaven and Earth Lord, who was flying at full speed ahead, naturally felt the fleet's acceleration, and his face turned gloomy. Damn it! The battleships of the Taiyu Shrine are even faster than I am. At this rate they will be able to catch up to me in less than 100 breaths. He had to think of a way to obstruct them. Otherwise, if the 4 battleships join forces and attack me from the front and back, won't I be dead for sure? Heaven and Earth Lord liked to fight, but he was not stupid or reckless. Now that things had developed to this stage, he would not sit still and wait for death. Of course he chose to take the initiative to attack. Swoosh. Swoosh swoosh. He quickly accumulated a large amount of divine power and suddenly turned to look at the 3 battleships. Through the antlers on his head, he released thousands of lightning pillars and huge flaming swords that filled the sky. Although there was still a distance of 60 to 70,000 miles between him and the fleet. But if the fleet followed closely behind him, it was equivalent to colliding head-on with the thousands of lightning pillars and hundreds of flaming swords. The 2 of them moved in opposite directions, and the time taken was even shorter, leaving not much time for the fleet to react. Moreover, with the Lord Hallmaster personally overseeing, the morale of the entire fleet's soldiers was high, and their confidence multiplied. They did not take the Heaven and Earth Lord seriously at all, and they did not expect him to be so bold as to attack them first. When the soldiers controlling the battleships saw the lightning pillars and flaming swords flying towards them, they were stunned for a moment. Even if they immediately came back to their senses and activated the array as quickly as possible to intercept the divine powers and secret skills, it was already too late. Boom boom boom. Bam bam bam. A deafening sound exploded, reverberating between heaven and earth. Hundreds of lightning pillars and flaming swords ruthlessly struck the 3 divine battleships. In the sky and on the ground, the space within a radius of 10,000 miles was immediately filled with endless lightning and fire. The destructive shockwaves spread out in all directions along with countless fragments of divine light. The surrounding mountains and forests within a radius of tens of thousands of miles were destroyed on the spot, causing smoke and dust to fill the sky. The 3 battleships were sent flying by the shockwaves, tumbling towards the ruins. Fortunately, the 3 Hallmasters acted in time and used their powerful divine powers to neutralize the terrifying shockwaves, stabilizing the battleships and preventing them from falling into the ruins. Of course, no matter how strong the battleship's defenses were, they could not be undamaged after suffering such a powerful attack. Craters and cracks appeared on the surface of each battleship. Fortunately, these were all external injuries and did not affect the normal use of the battleships. A large number of godly king experts quickly cast spells to repair the damage to the battleships. The Heaven and Earth Lord had achieved his goal. After casting spells to attack the 3 battleships, he laughed coldly and flew away. The 3 battleships were pushed back 1,000 miles. Stabilizing the formation, repairing the damage, and then speeding towards the east wasted a lot of time. The distance between the fleet and the Heaven and Earth Lord was increased to tens of thousands of miles. The distance between the fleet and the god-slaying battleships was increased to more than 300,000 miles. The Heaven and Earth Lord did this to buy time for himself and also unintentionally to buy more time for Zhou Xian. The 3 warships that had rejoined the chase became even more aggressive. Not only were the soldiers on the battleships furious, but even the 3 Hallmasters were furious. They swore to kill the Heaven and Earth Lord to establish their dominance. Damned beast, we've already spared its life by ignoring it, yet it still dares to attack us? Since it's seeking its own death, I'll grant it its wish. It's chasing that alien youth. We have the same goal. How can it be so stupid to attack us? Beasts have always been ignorant and stubborn. With their brains and intelligence, how can they understand that an enemy's enemy is a friend? Forget it. It's just a lowly beast. Even if it has the same goal as us, it has no right to be our friend. Perhaps the Heaven and Earth Lord is determined to get that alien youth and does not want us to get involved. Since it wants to snatch him from us, we can't let it off. We have to retaliate and teach it a lesson. Speed up and chase after it. Let's kill it first. You're tuning in to the Zhou Xian's Legacy YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.